Chapter 30 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. This doctrine had its commencement about half a century ago. Its chief founder was the French philosopher Comte. Comte, being a lover of systematic theory, and at the same time a man of religious tendency, was impressed by the then new physiological researches of Bichat, and he conceived the old idea, expressed in bygone days by Menenius Agrippa, that human societies, indeed all humankind, may be regarded as one whole, an organism, and men as live particles of separate organs, each having his definite destination to fulfill in the service of the whole organism. Comte was so fascinated by this idea that he founded his philosophical theory on it, and this theory so captivated him that he quite forgot that his point of departure was no more than a pretty comparison, suitable enough in a fable, but in no way justifiable as the foundation of a science. As it often happens, he took his pet hypothesis for an axiom, and so imagined that his whole theory was based upon the most firm and positive foundations. According to his theory, it appeared that, as mankind is an organism, therefore the knowledge of what man is, and what his relation to the world ought to be, is only possible through the knowledge of the properties of this organism. And to be able to learn these properties, man is fitted to make observations upon other, lower organisms, and to draw deductions from their lives. Therefore, first, the true and exclusive method of science, according to Comte, is the inductive one, and science is only science when it has experiment for its basis. Secondly, the final aim and the summit of science becomes the new science concerning the imaginary organism of mankind, or the organic being, mankind. This new hypothetic science is sociology. From this view of science, it generally turns out that all former knowledge was false, and that the whole history of mankind, in the sense of its self-consciousness, divides itself into three, or rather 2 periods. First, the theological and metaphysical period, from the beginning of the world to Comte, and, secondly, the modern period of true science, positive science, beginning with Comte. All this was very well, but there was one mistake in it, which was this, that all this edifice was built on the sand, on an arbitrary, and incorrect, assertion that mankind, collectively considered, was an organism. This assertion is arbitrary because, if we are to acknowledge the existence of mankind as an organism, which is beyond observation, we might as well acknowledge the existence of the triple God, and similar theological propositions. It was incorrect because to the idea of mankind, that is of men, the definition of an organism was added, whereas man lacks the essential characteristics of an organism, a center of sensation or consciousness. We call an elephant, as well as a bacterium, organisms, only because we suppose by analogy in these beings that there is unification of sensations, or consciousness. But human societies and mankind lack this essential, and therefore, however many other general character signs we may find in mankind and in an organism, without this, the assertion that man is an organism is incorrect. But, notwithstanding the arbitrariness and incorrectness of the fundamental proposition of positive philosophy, it was accepted by the so-called educated world with great sympathy, because of that great fact, important for the crowd, that it afforded a justification of the existing order of things, by recognizing the lawfulness of the existing division of labor, that is, of violence in mankind. It is remarkable in this respect that from the writings of Comte, composed of 2 parts, a positive philosophy and a positive politics, only the first part was accepted on new experimental principles by the learned world, that which justified the existing evil in human society. The second part, treating of the moral, altruistic duties following from this recognition of mankind as an organism, was considered not only unimportant, but even unscientific. Here the same thing was repeated which occurred with the 2 parts of Kant's writings. The critique of pure reason was accepted by science, but the critique of practical reason, that part which contains the essence of moral doctrine, was rejected. In the teaching of Comte, that was recognized to be scientific, which humored the reigning evil. But the positive philosophy accepted by the crowd, based on an arbitrary and incorrect supposition, was by itself too ill-grounded, and therefore too unsteady, and could not be sustained by itself. And now, among the idle play of ideas of so-called men of science, there has appeared a similarly arbitrary and incorrect assertion, not at all new, to the effect that all living beings, that is, organisms, proceed one from another. Not only one organism from another, but one organism from many. That during a very long period, 1,000,000 of years, for instance, not only may a fish and a duck have proceeded from one and the same forefather, but also one organism might have proceeded from many separate organisms. So, for instance, out of a swarm of bees a single animal may proceed. This arbitrary and incorrect assertion was accepted by the learned world with still greater sympathy. The assertion was arbitrary because no one has ever seen how one kind of organism is made from others, and therefore the hypothesis about the origin of species will always remain a mere supposition, and never become an experimental fact. The hypothesis was incorrect, because the solution of the problem of the origin of species, by the theory of the laws of inheritance and accommodation during an infinitely long period, is not a solution of the problem at all, but the mere reiteration of the question in another form. According to the solution of this problem by Moses, to oppose which is the object of Comte's theory, it appeared that the variety of the species of living beings proceeded from the will of God and his infinite omnipotence. According to the theory of evolution, it appears that the variety of species of living beings proceeded from themselves, in consequence of the infinite variety of conditions of inheritance and environment in an infinite period of time. The theory of evolution, speaking plainly, asserts only that, by chance, in an infinite period of time, anything you like may proceed from anything else you choose. This is no answer to the question. It is simply the same question put differently. Instead of will is put chance, and the coefficient of the infinite is transferred from omnipotence to time. But this new assertion, enforced by Darwin's followers in an arbitrary and inaccurate spirit, maintained the first assertion of Comte, and therefore it became the revelation for our time, and the foundation of all sciences, even that of the history of philosophy and religion. And besides, according to the naive confession of Darwin himself, the idea was awakened in him by the law of Malthus, and therefore he pointed to the struggle for existence, not only of men, but of all living beings, as a fundamental law of every living thing, and this was exactly what was wanted by the crowd of idle people for their own justification. Two unstable theories which could not stand on their own feet supported each other, and so received a show of stability. Both the theories bore in them a sense, precious to the crowd, that men are not to be blamed for the existing evil in human societies, that the existing order is what should be, and thus the new theory was accepted by the crowd in the sense wanted by them, with full confidence and unprecedented enthusiasm. Thus the new scientific doctrine was founded upon two arbitrary and incorrect propositions, accepted in the same way that dogmas of faith are accepted. Both in matter and form this new doctrine is remarkably like the Church Christian one. In matter, the similarity lies in the fact that in both doctrines alike a fantastical meaning is attached to really existing things, and this artificial meaning is taken as the object of our research. In the Church Christian doctrine, to Christ, who did really exist, is attributed the fantastic conception of being God himself, screened. In the positive doctrine, to the really existing fact of live men is attributed the fantastical attributes of an organism. In form, the similarity of these two doctrines is remarkable, since, in both cases, a theory emanating from one class of men is accepted as the only and infallible truth. In the Church Christian doctrine, the Church's way of understanding God's revelation to men is regarded as the sacred and only true one. In the doctrine of positivism, certain men's way of understanding science is regarded as absolutely correct and true. As the Church Christians regard the foundation of their Church as the only origin of true knowledge of God, and only out of a kind of courtesy admit that former believers may also be regarded as having formed a Church, so, in precisely the same manner, does positive science, according to its own statement, place its origin in Comte. And its representatives also only out of courtesy admit the existence of previous science, and that only as regarding certain thinkers, as, for instance, Aristotle. Both the Church and positive science altogether exclude the ideas of all the rest of mankind, and regard all knowledge outside their own as erroneous. The similarity persists. Just as to the support of the first advental theological dogmas of the Trinity and of the divinity of Christ comes the old, but newly interpreted, dogmas of man's fall and of his redemption by the death of Christ, and out of these dogmas is developed popular church teaching. So in our time, the old dogma of evolution comes in with new importance to help the fundamental dogma of Comte concerning the organism of mankind. And from these two elements the popular scientific doctrine has been formed. As in one teaching, so in the other. The new dogma is necessary for the support of the old one, and becomes comprehensible only in connection with it. If, to a believer in the divinity of Christ, it is not clearly comprehensible why God should come down to earth, the doctrine of atonement explains it. If it is not quite clear to a believer in the organism of mankind why a collection of individuals may be counted as an organism, the dogma of evolution is charged with the explanation. This dogma is needed to reconcile the contradictions and certainties of the first. Mankind is an organism, and we see that it does not contain the chief characteristic of an organism. How must we account for it? Here the dogma of evolution comes in and explains, mankind is an organism in a state of development. If you accept this, you may then consider mankind as such. As to any man free from superstitions about the Trinity and the divinity of Christ, it is impossible even to understand the force and the meaning of the teaching of atonement, which meaning comes only through the acknowledgement of Christ as God himself. So a man who is free from the positive superstition cannot even understand wherein lies the interest of the theory of the origin of species and of evolution. And this interest is explained only when we learn the fundamental dogma, that mankind is an organism. And as the subtleties of theology are only intelligible to those who believe in its fundamental dogmas, so also the subtleties of sociology, which now occupy the minds of all adherents of this recent and profound science, are intelligible only to believers. The doctrine of atonement is necessary to reconcile the contradiction between the first dogma and facts. God descended on earth to save men, but men are not saved. How then explain this? The dogma of atonement asserts, he saved those who believed in atonement. If you believe in atonement, you are saved. The similarity between these two doctrines holds good yet further. Being founded on dogmas accepted by faith, these doctrines neither question nor analyze their own principles, which, on the other hand, are used as starting points for the most extraordinary theories. The preachers of these call themselves, in theology, sanctified, in positive knowledge, scientific, in both cases infallible. And at the same time they conceive the most peremptory, incredible, and unfounded assertions, which they give forth with the greatest pomp and seriousness, and which are with equal pomp and seriousness contradicted in all their details by others who do not agree, and yet who equally recognize the fundamental dogmas. The Basil the Great of scientific doctrine, Herbert Spencer, in one of his first writings expresses these doctrines thus: societies and organisms, says he, are alike in the following points. First, in that, being conceived as small aggregates, they imperceptibly grow in mass, so that some of them become 10,000 times bigger than their originals. Secondly, in that, while in the beginning they have such simple structure that they may almost be considered structureless, in their growth they develop an ever-increasing complexity of structure. Thirdly, in that, though in their early undeveloped period there does not exist among them any dependence of particles upon one another, these particles by and by acquire a mutual dependence, which at last becomes so strong that the activity and the life of each part is possible only with the activity and the lives of all others. Fourthly, in this, that the life and the development of society is more independent and longer than the life and the development of every unit which goes to form it, and which is separately born and growing and acting and multiplying and dying, while the political body formed of such continues to live, one generation after another, developing in mass, in perfection of structure, and in functional activity. Then follow the points of difference between organisms and societies, and it is demonstrated that these differences are only seeming ones, and that organisms and societies are quite similar. To an impartial man the question at once arises, what are you speaking about, then? Why is mankind an organism or something similar? You say that societies are similar to organisms according to these 4 points, but even this comparison is incorrect. You take only a few characteristics of an organism, and you then apply them to human societies. You produce 4 points of similarity, then you take the points of difference, which you say are only seemingly so, and you conclude that human societies may be considered as organisms. But this is nothing else than an idle play of dialectics. On this ground we may consider as an organism everything we choose. I take the first thing which comes to my mind, a forest as it is planted in a field and grows up, first beginning as a small aggregate and imperceptibly increasing in mass. Secondly, in the beginning the structure of an organism is simple, then the complexity increases, and so on. This is the case with the forest. At first there are only birch trees, then hazel, and so on. First all the trees grow straight, and afterwards they interlace their branches. Thirdly, the dependence of the parts increases, so that the life of each part depends upon the lives and activities of all the others. It is exactly the same with the forest. The nut tree keeps the trunks warm. If you hew it down, the other trees will be frozen in winter. The underwood keeps off wind. The seed trees continue the species. The tall and leafy ones give shadow. And the life of each tree depends upon that of the rest. Fourthly, separate parts may die, but the whole organism continues to live. Separate trees perish, but the forest continues in life and growth. The same holds good with the example so often brought by the defenders of the scientific doctrine. Cut off an arm, the arm will die. We may say, remove a tree from the shadow and the ground of a forest, it will die. Another remarkable similarity between this scientific doctrine and the Church Christian one, and any other theory founded upon propositions which are accepted through faith, lies in their mutual capacity of being proof against logic. Having demonstrated that by this theory a forest may be considered as an organism, you think you have proved to the followers of the theory the incorrectness of their definition? Not at all. Their definition of an organism is so loose and plastic that they can apply it to everything they like. Yes, they will say, you may consider the forest, too, as an organism. A forest is a mutual cooperation of the individuals who do not destroy each other, an aggregate. Its parts can also pass into a closer relationship, and by differentiation and integration it may become an organism. Then you will say that, in that case, the birds, too, and the insects, and the herbs of this forest, which mutually cooperate and do not destroy each other, may be considered, with the trees, to be an organism. They would agree to this, too. According to their theory, we may consider as an organism every collection of living beings which mutually cooperate, and do not destroy one another. You can establish a connection and cooperation between everything you like, and, according to evolution, you can assert that from anything may proceed anything else you like, if a long enough period is granted. To those who believe in the Trinity, it is impossible to prove that it does not exist. But one can show them that their assertion is not based on knowledge, but is an assertion of faith, and that if they assert that there are 3 gods, I have an equal right to assert that there are 17½ gods. One may say the same thing with yet better ground to the followers of positive and evolutional science. On the basis of this science one could undertake to prove anything one liked. And the strangest thing of all is that this same positive science regards the scientific method as a condition of true knowledge, and that it has itself defined the elements of the scientific method. It professes that common sense is the scientific method, and yet common sense itself discloses the fallacies of the doctrine at every step. The moment those who occupied the position of saints felt there was no longer anything sacred in them, that they are cursed like the Pope and our own synod, they immediately called themselves not merely sacred, but most sacred. The moment science felt that it had given up common sense, it called itself the science of reason, the only really scientific science. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Division of labor is the law pervading everything that exists. Therefore it must exist in human societies too. That may be so, but the question still remains whether the existing division of labor in human society is the division which ought to exist. And when men consider a certain division of labor unreasonable and unjust, no science whatever can prove to men that what they consider unreasonable and unjust ought to continue. The theological theory demonstrated that power is of God, and it very well may be so. But the question still remains, to whom is the power given? To Catherine the Empress, or to the rebel Pugachev? And no theological subtleties whatever can solve this difficulty. Moral philosophy demonstrates that a state is merely a form of the social development of the individual, but the question still remains, can the state of a Nero, or that of a Genghis Khan, be considered a form of such development? And no transcendentalism whatever can solve that difficulty. It is the same with scientific science also. Division of labor is the condition of the life of organisms and of human societies. But what have we to consider in these human societies as an organic division of labor? However much science studies the division of labor in the molecules of a tapeworm, all the observations cannot compel men to acknowledge as correct a division of labor which is repudiated by their reason and conscience. However convincing the proofs of the division of labor in the cells of investigated organisms may be, a man who has not yet lost his reason will say it is wrong that some should only weave cloth all their long life, and that this is not division of labor, but oppression of human beings. Herbert Spencer and others affirm that, as there is a whole population of weavers, the weaver's activity is in organic division of labor. In saying this, they use a similar line of reasoning to the theologians. There is a power, therefore it is of God, whatever it may be. There are weavers, therefore they exist as a result of the law of division of labor. There might be some sense in this if the power and the position of weavers were created by themselves. But we know that they are not, but that it is we who create them. Well then, we ought to ascertain whether we have established this power according to the will of God or of ourselves, and whether we have called these weavers into being by virtue of some organic law or from some other cause. Here are men earning their living by agriculture, as it is proper for all men to do. One man has set up a smith's forge and mended his plough. His neighbor comes to him and asks him to mend his plough too, and promises to give labor or money in return. A second comes with a similar request. Others follow. And in the society of these men a form of division of labor arises. Thus one man becomes a smith. Another man has taught his children well. His neighbor brings him his children, and asks him to teach them, and thus a teacher is formed. But the smith, as well as the teacher, become, and continue to be, a smith and a teacher only because they were asked, and they remain a smith and a teacher only as long as people require their trades. If it happens that too many smiths and teachers appear, or if their labor is no longer wanted, they at once, according to common sense, throw aside their trade, and become laborers again, as it everywhere and always happens where there is no cause for the violation of a right division of labor. Men who behave in such a way are directed both by their reason and their conscience. and therefore we, who are endowed with reason and conscience, all agree that such a division of labor is a right one. But if it were to happen that smiths, having the possibility of compelling other men to labor for them, were to continue to make horseshoes when there was no longer a demand for them, and teachers were to wish to continue to teach when there was nobody to be taught, then, to every impartial man endowed with reason and conscience, it would be obvious that this is not real division of labor, but a usurpation of other men's labor, because such a division could no longer be tested satisfactorily by the sole standard by which we may know whether it is right or not, the demand of such labor by other men, and a voluntary compensation offered for it by them. But exactly such a surplus, however, is what scientific science terms a division of labor. Men do what is not required, and they ask to be fed for it, and say it is just, because it is division of labor. The chief social evil of a people, not with us alone, is the countless horde of state officials. The chief cause of the economical misery of our days is what is called in England overproduction, that is, the production of an enormous quantity of articles wanted by nobody, and which no one knows how to get rid of. All of this comes, simply, from the strange idea about the division of labor. It would be very strange to see a bootmaker who considered that men were bound to feed him because, forsooth, he continued to produce boots wanted by no one. But what shall we say about those men in government, church, science, and art, who not only do not produce anything tangibly useful for the people, but whose produce is wanted by nobody, yet who as boldly require to be well fed and clothed on account of the division of labor? There may be magicians for whose activity there is a demand, and to whom men give casks and spirits. But we cannot even imagine the existence of magicians who, while their magic is not wanted by anybody, require to be fed simply because they wish to practice their art. Yet in our world this is the very position of the men in church and state, of the men of science and art. And it all proceeds from that false conception of the division of labor, defined not by reason and conscience, but by deductions to which these scientists so unanimously resort. Division of labor indeed has always existed, but it is correct only when man decides it by his reason and conscience, and not by his making observations on it, and the conscience and the reason of all men solve this question in the simplest and surest way. They always decide the question by recognizing the division of labor to be right only when the special activity of a man is so necessary to others that they freely offer to feed him in compensation for what they ask him to do for them. But when a man from his infancy up to his 30th year lives on the shoulders of other men, promising to do, when he finishes his studies, something very useful, which nobody has ever asked him for, and then for the rest of his life lives in the same way, promising only to do presently something which nobody asks him to do, this would not be a true division of labor, but, as it really is, only the violation by a strong man of the labor of others. The same appropriation of other men's labor by a strong man, which formerly theology called divine predestination, philosophy, inevitable conditions of life, and now scientific science, the organic division of labor. The entire importance of the ruling science consists in this alone. This science is now the dispenser of diplomas for idleness, because in her temples she alone analyzes and determines what activity in the social organism is parasitic and what organic. As if each man could not decide much better, and more quickly too, by consulting his own reason and conscience. As formerly, both for clergy and for statesmen, there could have been no doubt as to who were most necessary to other people, so now, for the believers in positive science, it seems that there can be no doubt about this, that their own activity is undoubtedly an organic one. They, the factors of science and art, are the cells of the brain, the most precious cells of all the human organism. Let us leave them to reign, eat, drink, and be feasted, as priests and sophists of old have before them, so long as they do not deprave men. Since men are reasonable creatures, they have discriminated good from evil, making use of what has been done in this direction before them by others, have struggled with evil, seeking a true and better way, and slowly but unceasingly have advanced in this way. But always across the road different deceptions stood before them, trying to assure them that this struggle was not at all necessary, and that they should submit to the tide of life. First, the awful deceptions of the old church. Little by little, with dreadful struggle and effort, men got rid of them. But scarcely had they done so, when in their place arose new ones, state and philosophical deceptions. Men freed themselves from these too, and now a new deceit, a still worse one, has sprung up in their path, the scientific deception. This new deception is exactly what the old ones were. Its essence consists in the substitution of an externality for reason and conscience, and this externality is observation, as in theology it was revelation. The snare of this science consists in this, that, having exposed some bare-faced perversions of the activity of reason and conscience, it destroys men's confidence in both reason and conscience. Hiding their lie clothed in a scientific theory, scientists assure men that by studying external phenomena, they study undeniable facts, which will reveal to them the law of man's life. Things which are the property of conscience and reason are now to be discovered by observation alone. These men lose the conception of good and evil, and thus become unable to understand those expressions and definitions of good and evil which have been worked out during the entire former existence of mankind. All that reason and conscience say to them, all that they have said to the highest representatives of men since the world has existed, all this, in their slang, is conditional and subjective. All this must be left behind. It is said that by reason one cannot apprehend the truth, because reason is liable to error. There is another way, unmistakable and almost mechanical. One must study facts on the ground of science. That is, on two groundless suppositions, positivism and evolution, which are offered as the most undoubted truths. With mock solemnity the ruling science asserts that the solution of all the questions of life is only possible through studying the facts of nature, and especially those of organisms. The credulous crowd of youth, overwhelmed by the novelty of this authority, not only not destroyed, not yet even touched by critics, rush to the study of these facts of natural sciences, to that only way which, according to the assertion of the ruling doctrine, alone can lead to the elucidation of all questions of life. But the farther the students proceed in this study, the farther do they remove not only the possibility of solving the questions of life, but even the very thought of this solution. The more they grow accustomed, not so much to observe themselves, as to believe other men's observations on their word, to believe in cells, in protoplasm, in the fourth dimension of matter, and so on, the more the form hides from them the contents. The more they lose the consciousness of good and evil, and the capacity of understanding those expressions and definitions of good and evil which have been worked out in all the former career of mankind, the more they appropriate to themselves that special scientific slang of conditional expressions, which have no common human meaning in them. The farther and farther they get into the thick forest of observations lighted by anything, the more they lose the capacity, not only of independent thought, but even of understanding other men's fresh human ideas which are not included in their Talmud. But chiefly they pass their best years in losing the habit of life, that is, of labor, and accustom themselves to consider their own position justified, and thus become physically good-for-nothing parasites, and, mentally, dislocate their brains and lose all power of thought production. So, their capacities more and more blunted, they acquire by degrees self-assurance, which deprives them forever of the possibility of returning to a simple, laborious life, and to any plain, clear, common, human manner of thinking. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. The division of labor has always existed in human society, and I dare say always will exist. But the question for us is, not if it has been and will still continue, but what should guide us in providing that this division may be a right one. If we take the facts of observation for our standard, we refuse to have any standard at all. For every division of labor which we see among men, and which may seem to us to be right, we shall consider right. And this is what the ruling scientific science is leading us to. Division of labor. Some are occupied with mental and spiritual, others with muscular and physical labor. With what an assurance men express this! They wish to think it, and so that which is transparently the ancient violence seems to them in reality a fair exchange of services. Thou, or rather you, because it is always the many who have to feed the one, you feed me, dress me, do for me all this rough labor which I require of you, and to which you are accustomed from your infancy, and I will do for you that mental work to which I have already become accustomed. Give me bodily food, and in return I will give you the spiritual. The statement seems fair, and it would really be so if such exchange of services were free. If those who supply the bodily food were not obliged to supply it before they get to the spiritual. The producer of the spiritual food says, "In order that I may be able to give you this food, you must feed me, clothe me, and remove all filth from my house." But the producer of bodily food must do his work without making any claims of his own, and he has to give the bodily food, whether he receives spiritual food or not. If the exchange were a free one, the conditions on both sides would be equal. We agree that spiritual food is as necessary to man as bodily. But the learned man, the artist, says, "Before we can begin to serve men by giving them spiritual food, we want men to provide us with bodily food." But why should not the producers of this say, "Before we begin to serve you with bodily food, we want spiritual food, and until we receive it we cannot labor"? You say, "I require the labor of a plowman, a smith, a bookmaker, a carpenter, masons, and others, in order that I may prepare the spiritual food I have to offer." Every workman might say, too, "Before I go to work to prepare bodily food for you, I want the fruits of the Spirit. In order to have strength for laboring, I require a religious teaching, the social order of common life, application of knowledge to labor, and the joys and comforts which art gives. I have no time to work out for myself a teaching concerning the meaning of life. Give it to me. I have no time to think out statutes of common life which would prevent the violation of justice. Give me this, too. I have no time to study mechanics, natural philosophy, chemistry, technology. Give me books with information as to how I am to improve my tools, my ways of working, my dwelling, its heating and lighting. I have no time to occupy myself with poetry, with plastic art or music. Give me the excitements and comforts necessary for life. Give me the productions of the arts." You say it would be impossible for you to do your important and necessary business if you were deprived of the labor that working people do for you. And I say, a workman may declare, "It is impossible for me to do my important and necessary business, not less important than yours, to plow, to cart away refuse, and to clean your houses, if I am deprived of a religious guidance corresponding to the wants of my intellect and my conscience, of a reasonable government which will secure my labor, of information for easing my labor, and the enjoyment of art to ennoble it. All you have hitherto offered me in the shape of spiritual food is not only of no use to me whatever, I cannot even understand to whom it could be of any use. and until I receive this nourishment, proper for me as for every man, I cannot produce bodily food to feed you with." What if the working people should speak thus? And if they did, it would be no jest, but the simplest justice. If a workman said this, he would be far more in the right than a man of intellectual labor, because the labor produced by the workman is more urgent and more necessary than that of the intellectual worker, and because a man of intellect is hindered by nothing from giving that spiritual food which he promised to give, while the working man is hindered in giving the bodily food by the fact that he himself is short of it. What, then, should we intellectual laborers answer, if such simple and lawful claims were made upon us? How should we satisfy these claims? Should we satisfy the religious wants of the people by the catechism of Philaret, by sacred histories of Sokolov, by the literature sent out by monasteries and cathedrals? Should we satisfy their demand for order by the code of laws, and cassation verdicts of different departments, or by reports of committees and commissions? And should we satisfy their want of knowledge by giving them spectrum analysis, a survey of the Milky Way, speculative geometry, microscopic investigations, controversies concerning spiritualism and mediumism, the activity of academies of science? How should we satisfy their artistic wants? By Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, L. Tolstoy? By pictures of French salons, and of those of our artists who represent naked women, satin, velvet, and landscapes, and pictures of domestic life? By the music of Wagner, and that of our own musicians? All this is of no use, and cannot be of use, because we, with our right to utilize the labor of the people, and absence of all duties in preparation of their spiritual food, have quite lost from sight the single destination our activity should have. We do not even know what is required by the workman. We have even forgotten his mode of life, his views of things, his language. We have even lost sight of the very working people themselves, and we study them like some ethnographical rarity or newly discovered continent. Demanding for ourselves bodily food, we have taken upon ourselves to provide the spiritual. But in consequence of the imaginary division of labor, according to which we may not only first take our dinner and afterwards do our work, but may during many generations dine luxuriously and do no work, we, in the way of compensation for our food, have prepared something which is of use, as it seems to us, for ourselves and for science and art, but of no use whatever for those very people whose labor we consume under the pretext of providing them in return with intellectual food. Not only is of no use, but is quite unintelligible and distasteful to them. In our blindness, we have to such a degree left out of sight the duty we took upon us, that we have even forgotten for what our labor is being done, and the very people whom we undertook to serve we have made an object of our scientific and artistic activities. We study them and represent them for our own pleasure and amusement, but we have quite forgotten that it is our duty not to study and depict, but to serve them. We have to such a degree left out of sight the duty we assumed, that we have not even noticed that other people do what we undertook in the departments of science and art, and that our place turns out to be occupied. It appears that while we have been in controversy, now about the Immaculate Conception, and now about spontaneous generation, now about spiritualism, and now about the forms of atoms, now about pangenesis, now about protoplasms, and so on, all this while the people none the less required spiritual food, and the abortive outcasts of science and art began to provide for the people this spiritual food to the order of various speculators, who had in view exclusively their own profit and gain. Now, for some 40 years in Europe, and 10 years in Russia, millions of books and pictures and songs have been circulating, shows have been opened, and the people gaze and sing and receive intellectual food, though not from those who promised to provide it for them. And we, who justify our idleness by the need for that intellectual food which we pretend to provide for the people, are sitting still and taking no notice. But we cannot do so, because our final justification has vanished from under our feet. We have taken upon ourselves a peculiar department. We have a peculiar functional activity of our own. We are the brain of the people. They feed us, and we have undertaken to teach them. Only for the sake of this have we freed ourselves from labor. What, then, have we been teaching them? They have waited years, tens of years, hundreds of years, and we are still conversing among ourselves, and teaching each other, and amusing ourselves, and have quite forgotten them. We have so totally forgotten them, that others have taken upon themselves to teach and amuse them, and we have not even become aware of this in our flippant talk about division of labor, and it is very obvious that all our talk about the utility we offer to the people was only a shameful excuse. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. There was a time when the Church guided the intellectual life of the men of our world. The Church promised men happiness, and in compensation for this, she freed herself from taking part in mankind's common struggle for life. As soon as she did this, she went away from her calling, and men turned from her. It was not the errors of the Church which originally caused her ruin, but the fact that, by the help of the secular power, in the time of Constantine, her ministers violated the law of labor, and then their claim to idleness and luxury gave birth to the errors. As soon as she obtained this power, she began to care for herself, and not for humanity, whom she had taken upon herself to serve. The ministers of the Church gave themselves up to idleness and depravity. The state took upon itself to guide men's lives. The state promised men justice, peace, security, order, satisfaction of common intellectual and material wants, and, in compensation, men who served the state freed themselves from taking part in the struggle for life. And the state's servants, as soon as they were able to utilize other men's labor, acted in the same way as the ministers of the Church. They had not in view the people, but, from kings down to the lowest state functionaries, in Rome, as well as in France, England, Russia, and America, they gave themselves over to idleness and depravity. Now men have lost their faith in the state, and anarchy is now seriously advocated as an ideal. The state has lost its prestige among men, only because its ministers have claimed the right of utilizing the people's labor for themselves. Science and art have done the same, assisted by the state power which they took upon themselves to sustain. They also have claimed and obtained for themselves the right of idleness, and of utilizing other men's labor, and also have been false to their calling. And their errors, too, proceeded only from the fact that their ministers, pointing to a falsely conceived principle of the division of labor, claimed for themselves the right to utilize the work of the people, and so lost the meaning of their calling, making the aim of their activity not the utility of the people, but some mysterious activity of science and art. And also, like their forerunners, they have given themselves over to idleness and depravity, though not so much to a fleshly as to an intellectual corruption. It is said that science and art have done much for mankind. That is quite true. Church and state have given much to humanity, not because they abused their power, or because their ministers forsook the common life of men, and the eternal duty of labor for life, but in spite of this. The Roman Republic was powerful, not because its citizens were able to lead a life of depravity, but because it could number among them men who were virtuous. This is the case with science and art. Science and art have effected much for mankind, not because their ministers had sometimes formerly, and have always at present, the possibility of freeing themselves from labor, but because men of genius, not utilizing these rights, have forwarded the progress of mankind. The class of learned men and artists who claim, on account of a false division of labor, the right of utilizing other men's labor, cannot contribute to the progress of true science and true art, because a lie can never produce a truth. We are so accustomed to our pampered or debilitated representatives of intellectual labor that it would seem very strange if a learned man, or an artist, were to plow or cart manure. We think that, were he to do so, all would go to ruin, that all his wisdom would be shaken out of him, and that the great artistic images he carries in his breast would be soiled by the manure. But we are so accustomed to our present conditions that we do not wonder at our ministers of science, that is, ministers and teachers of truth, compelling other people to do for them that which they could very well do themselves, passing half their time eating, smoking, chattering in liberal gossip, reading newspapers, novels, visiting theaters. We are not surprised to see our philosopher in an inn, in a theater, at a ball. We do not wonder when we learn that those artists who delight and ennoble our souls pass their lives in drunkenness, in playing cards, in company with loose women, or do things still worse. Science and art are fine things, but just because they are fine things, men ought not to spoil them by associating them with depravity, by freeing themselves from man's duty to serve, by labor, his own life and the lives of other men. Science and art have forwarded the progress of mankind. Yes, but not because men of science and art, under the pretext of a division of labor, taught men by word, and chiefly by deed, to utilize by violence the misery and sufferings of the people, in order to free themselves from the very first and unquestionable human duty of laboring with their hands in the common struggle of mankind with nature. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. But, you say, it is this very division of labor, the freeing men of science and of art from the necessity of earning their bread, that has rendered possible the extraordinary success in science which we see today. If everybody were to plow, these enormous results would not be attained. You would not have those astonishing successes which have so enlarged man's power over nature. You would not have those discoveries in astronomy, which so strike the minds of men, and promote navigation. There would be no steamers, railways, wonderful bridges, tunnels, steam engines, telegraphs, photographs, telephones, sewing machines, phonographs, electricity, telescopes, spectroscopes, microscopes, chloroform, Lister bandages, carbolic acid. End quote. I will not attempt to enumerate all the things of which our century is proud. This enumeration, and the ecstasy of the contemplation of ourselves and of our great deeds, you can find in almost every newspaper and popular book. And these raptures are so often repeated, and we are so seldom tired of praising ourselves, that we really have come to believe, with Jules Verne, that science and art never made such progress as in our time. And as all this is rendered possible only by division of labor, how can we avoid countenancing it? Let us suppose that the progress of our century is really striking, astonishing, extraordinary. Let us suppose, too, that we are particularly lucky in living at such an extraordinary time. But let us try to ascertain the value of these successes, not by our own self-contentment, but by the very principle of the division of labor. That is, by the intellectual labor of scientists for the advantage of the people, which has to compensate for the freedom of its servants from manual toil. This progress is very striking indeed, but owing to some bad luck, recognized too by the men of science, this progress has not yet ameliorated, but has rather deteriorated, the condition of working men. Though a working man, instead of walking, can use the railway, it is this very railway which has caused his forest to be burned, and has carried away his bread from under his very nose, and put him into a condition which is next door to slavery to the railway proprietor. If, thanks to steam engines and machines, a workman can buy cheap and bad calico, it is these very engines and machines which have deprived him of his livelihood and brought him to a state of entire slavery to the manufacturer. If there are telegraphs, which he is not forbidden to use, but which he does not use because he cannot afford it, still each of his productions, the value of which rises, is bought up at low prices before his very eyes by capitalists, thanks to that telegraph, before he has even become aware that the article is in demand. If there are telephones and telescopes, novels, operas, picture galleries, and so on, the life of the workman is not at all improved by any of them, because all, owing to the same unlucky chance, are beyond his reach. So that, after all, these wonderful discoveries and productions of art, if they have not made the life of working people worse, have by no means improved it. And on this the men of science are agreed. So that, if we apply not our self-contemplating rapture, but the very standard on which the ground of the division of labor is defended, utility to the working world, to the question as to the reality of the successes attained by the sciences and arts, we shall see that we have not yet any sound reason for the self-contentment to which we consign ourselves so willingly. A peasant uses the railway, a peasant's wife buys calico. In the cottage a lamp, and not a pine knot, burns, and the peasant lights his pipe with a match. All this is comfortable. But what right have I from this to say that railways and factories have done good to the people? If a peasant uses the railway, and buys a lamp, calico, and matches, he does it only because we cannot forbid his doing so. But we all know very well that railways and factories were not built for the use of the people. And why, then, should the casual comfort a workman obtains by chance be brought forward as a proof of the usefulness of these institutions to the people? We all know very well that, if the engineers and capitalists who build a railway or a factory thought about the working people, they thought only how to make the most possible use of them. And we see they have fully succeeded in doing so in Europe and America, as well as in Russia. In every hurtful thing there is something useful. After a house has been burned down, we can sit and warm ourselves, and light our pipes from one of the firebrands. But should we therefore say that a conflagration is beneficial? Whatever we do, do not let us deceive ourselves. We all know very well the motives for building railways and factories, and for producing kerosene and matches. An engineer builds a railway for the government, to facilitate wars, or for the capitalists, for their financial purposes. He makes machines for manufacturers for his own advantage, and for the profit of capitalists. All that he makes or plans he does for the purpose of the government, the capitalists, and other rich people. His most skillful inventions are either directly harmful to the people, such as guns, torpedoes, solitary prisons, and so on, or they are not only useless but quite inaccessible to them, such as electric light, telephones, and the innumerable improvements of comfort. Or, lastly, they deprave the people and rob them of their last kopeck, that is, their last labor, for spirits, wine, beer, opium, tobacco, finery, and all sorts of trifles. But if it happens sometimes that the inventions of men of science and the works of engineers are of use to the people, as, for instance, railways, calicos, steel, scythes, it only proves that in this world of ours everything is mutually connected, and that out of every hurtful activity there may arise an accidental good for those to whom the activity was hurtful. Men of science and of art could say that their activity was useful for the people only if, in their activity, they have aimed at serving the people, as they now aim to serve the government and capitalists. We could have said that only if the men of science and art made the wants of the people their object, but such is not the case. All learned men are occupied with their sacred businesses, which lead to the investigation of protoplasms, the spectrum analysis of stars, and so on. But concerning investigations as to how to set an axe, or with what kind it is more advantageous to hew, which saw is the most handy, with what flour bread shall be made, how it may best be kneaded, how to set it to rise, how to heat and to build stoves, what food, drink, or crockery ware it is best to use, what mushrooms may be eaten, and how they may be prepared more conveniently. Science never troubles itself, or does so very slightly. Yet all this is the business of science. I know that, according to its own definition, science must be useless, but this is only an excuse, and a very impudent one. The business of science is to serve people. We have invented telegraphs, telephones, phonographs, but what improvements have we made in the life of the people? We have catalogued 2 millions of insects, but have we domesticated a single animal since biblical times, when all our animals had long been domesticated, and still the elk and the deer, and the partridge and the grouse and the woodhen are wild? Botanists have discovered the cells, and in the cells protoplasms, and in protoplasms something else, and in this something else again. These occupations will go on for a long time, and evidently never end, and therefore learned men have no time to do anything useful. Hence, from the times of the ancient Egyptians and Hebrews, when wheat and lentils were already cultivated, down to the present time, not a single plant has been added for the nourishment of the people except potatoes, and these were not discovered by science. We have invented torpedoes and house drains, but the spinning wheel, weaving looms, plows and axe handles, flails and rakes, buckets and well sweeps, are still the same as in the time of Rurik. If some things have been improved, it is not the learned who have improved them, but the unlearned. The same is the case with art. Many people are acclaimed as great writers. We have carefully analyzed their works, have written mountains of critiques and criticisms upon criticisms, and still more criticisms on criticisms. We have collected pictures in galleries, and thoroughly studied in detail different schools of art. And we possess symphonies and operas that it is with great difficulty we ourselves can listen to. But what have we added to the folklore, legends, tales, songs for the people? What pictures, what music have we created for the people? Books and pictures are published, and harmoniums are made for the people, but we did not participate in either. What is most striking and obvious is the false tendency of our science and art, which manifests itself in those departments which, according to their own propositions, would seem to be useful to people, but which, owing to this tendency, appear rather pernicious than useful. An engineer, a surgeon, a teacher, an artist, an author, seem by their very professions to be obliged to serve the people. But what do we see? With the present tendency, they can bring to the people nothing but harm. An engineer and a mechanic must work with capital. Without capital they are good for nothing. All their training is of such a nature that, in order to make use of it, they need capital and the employment of work-people on a large scale, to say nothing of the fact that they themselves are accustomed to spend from 1,500 to 1,000 rubles a year on themselves, and therefore cannot go to live in a village, since no one there can give them any such remuneration. From their very occupations they are not fit for the service of the people. They understand how to calculate the arch of a bridge by means of the higher mathematics, how to calculate power and the transfer of power in an engine, and so on. But they are at a loss to meet the plain requirements of common labor. They do not know how to improve the plough or the cart, or how to make a brook passable, taking into consideration the conditions of a workman's life. They know and understand nothing of all this, less even than the poorest peasant does. Give them workshops, and plenty of people, order engines from abroad, and then they will arrange these matters. But to find out how to ease the labor of the millions of the people in their present conditions, they do not know and cannot do it, and therefore, by their knowledge and habits and wants, they are not at all fit for this business. A surgeon is in a still worse condition. His imaginary science is of such a nature that he understands how to cure those only who have nothing to do, and who can utilize other men's labor. He requires a countless number of expensive accessories, instruments, medicines, sanitary dwellings, food, and drains, in order that he may act scientifically. Besides his fee, he demands such expenses that, in order to cure one patient, he must kill with starvation hundreds of those who bear this expense. He has studied under eminent persons in the capital cities, who attended only to those patients whom they may take into hospital, or who can afford to buy all the necessary medicines and machines, and even go at once from north to south, to these or those mineral waters, as the case may be. Their science is of such a kind that every country surgeon complains that there is no possibility of attending to the work people, who are so poor that they cannot afford sanitary accommodations, and that there are no hospitals, and that he cannot attend to the business alone, that he requires help and assistant surgeons. What does this really mean? It means this, that the want of the necessaries of life is the chief cause of people's misfortunes, and the source of diseases, as well as of their spreading and incurability. Now science, under the banner of the division of labor, calls its champions to help the people. Science has settled satisfactorily about the rich classes, and seeks how to cure those who can get everything necessary for the purpose, and it sends persons to cure in the same way those who have nothing to spare. But there are no means, and therefore they must be raised from the people, who become ill and catch diseases, and cannot be cured for want of means. The advocates of the healing art for the people say that, up to the present time, this business has not been sufficiently developed. Evidently it is not yet developed, because if, which God forbid, it were developed among our people, and, instead of 2 doctors and midwives and 2 assistant surgeons in the district, there should be 20 sent, as they want, then there would soon be no one left to attend to. The scientific cooperation for the benefit of the people must be of quite a different kind, and this, which ought to exist, has not yet begun. It will begin when a man of science, an engineer or a surgeon, ceases to consider lawful that division of labor, or rather that taking away other men's labor, which now exists, and when he no longer considers that he has the right to take, I do not say hundreds of thousands, but even a moderate sum of 1,000 or 500 rubles as compensation for his services. But when such a man comes to live among laboring people, in the same condition and in the same way as they, and applies his information in mechanics, technics, or hygiene to cure them. But at present, scientific men, who are fed at the expense of the workman, have quite forgotten the conditions of the life of these men. They ignore, as they say, these conditions, and are quite seriously offended that their imaginary knowledge does not find application among the people. The departments of the healing art, as well as of the mechanical, have not yet been touched. The questions how best to divide the period of labor, how and upon what it is best to feed, how best to dress, how to counteract dampness and cold, how best to wash, to suckle and swaddle children, and so on, and all these applied to the conditions in which the workers now exist, all these questions have not yet been faced. The same applies to the activity of scientific teachers, the pedagogues. Science has arranged this business, too, in such a way that teaching according to science is possible only for those who are rich. And the teachers, like the engineers and surgeons, are involuntarily drawn towards money, and among us in Russia especially towards the government. And this cannot be otherwise, because a school properly arranged, and the general rule is that the more scientifically a school is arranged, the more expensive it is, with convertible benches, globes, maps, libraries, and manuals for teachers and pupils, is just such a school to maintain which it is necessary to double the taxes of the people. So science wants to have it. The children are necessary for work, and the more so with the poorer people. The advocates of science say, Pedagogy is even now of use for the people, but let it develop, then it will be still better. But if it will develop till instead of 20 schools in a district there will be 100, all of them scientific, and the parents forced to keep up these schools, then they will be still poorer, and will want the labor of their children still more urgently. What is to be done, then? To this they will reply, the government will establish schools, and will make education obligatory as it is in the rest of Europe. End quote. But the money will still have to be raised from the people, and labor will be still harder for them, and they will have less time to spare from their labor, and there will then be no obligatory education at all. There is, again, only one escape: for a teacher to live in the conditions of a workman, and to teach for that compensation which will be freely offered him. Such is the false tendency of science, which deprives it of the possibility to fulfill its duty in serving the people. But this false tendency of our educated class is still more obvious in art activity, which for the sake of its very meaning ought to be accessible to the people. Science may point to its stupid excuse that science is acting for science, and that when fully developed it will become accessible to the people. But art, if it is art indeed, ought to be accessible to all, especially to those for whose sake it is created. But our art strikingly denounces its factors, in that they do not wish, and do not understand, and are not able to be of use to the people. A painter, in order to produce his great works, must have a large studio, in which at least 40 joiners or bootmakers might work, who are now freezing or suffocating in wretched lodgings. But this is not all. He requires models, costumes, journeys from place to place. The Academy of Art has spent millions of rubles, collected from the people, for the encouragement of art. And the productions of this art are hung in palaces, and are neither intelligible to the people, nor wanted by them. Musicians, in order to express their great ideas, must gather about 200 men with white neckties or in special costumes, and spend hundreds of thousands of rubles arranging operas. But this art production would never appear to the people, even if they could afford to use it, as anything but perplexing or dull. The authors, writers, would seem not to need any particular accommodations, studios, models, orchestras, or actors. But here also it turns out that an author, a writer, in order to prepare his great works, wants travelling, palaces, cabinets, enjoyments of art, theatres, concerts, mineral waters, and so on, to say nothing of all the comforts of his dwelling and all the comforts of his life. If he himself has not saved up enough money for this purpose, he is given a pension, in order that he may compose better. And again, these writings, which we value so highly, remain for the people rubbish, and are not at all necessary to them. What if, according to the wish of men of science and art, such producers of mental food should so multiply, that in every village it would be necessary to build a studio, provide an orchestra, and keep an author in the conditions which men of art consider indispensable to them? I dare say working people would make a vow never to look at a picture, or listen to a symphony, or read poetry and novels, in order only not to be compelled to feed all these good-for-nothing parasites. And why should not men of art serve the people? In every cottage there are holy images and pictures. Each peasant, each woman of the people, sings. Many have instruments of music, and all can relate stories, repeat poetry, and many of them read. How came it to pass that these two things, which were as much made for one another as a key for a lock, were separated? And why are they so separated that we cannot imagine how to reunite them? Tell a painter to paint without a studio, models, costumes, and to draw penny pictures, and he will say that this would be a denial of art as he understands it. Tell a musician to play on a harmonium, and to teach countrywomen to sing songs. Tell a poet to throw aside writing poems and novels and satires, and to compose songbooks for the people, and stories and tales which might be intelligible to illiterate persons. They will say you are cracked. But is it not being worse than cracked when the men who have freed themselves from labor because they promised to provide mental food for those who have brought them up and are feeding and clothing them, have afterwards so forgotten their promise that they have ceased to understand how to make food fit for the people? Yet this very forsaking of their promises they consider dignifies them. Such is the case everywhere, they say. Then everywhere the case is very unreasonable, and it will be so while men, under the pretext of division of labor, promise to provide mental food for the people, but only swallow up the labor of the people. Men will serve the people with science and art only when, living among them and in the same way as the people do, putting forth no claims whatever, they offer to the people their scientific and artistic services, leaving it to the free will of the people to accept or refuse them. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. To say that the activities of the arts and sciences have cooperated in forwarding the progress of mankind, and by these activities to mean that which is now called by this name, is as to say that an awkward moving of the oars, hindering the progress of a boat going down the stream, is forwarding the progress of the boat, while it only hinders it. The so-called division of labor, that is, the violation of other men's labor, which has become in our time a condition of the activity of men of art and science, has been, and still remains, the chief cause of the slowness of the progress of mankind. The proof of it we have in the acknowledgment that the acquisitions of art and science are not accessible to the working classes, because of a wrong distribution of wealth, and the incorrectness of this distribution does not diminish in proportion to the progress of art and science, but rather increases. Nor is it astonishing that such is the case, because the incorrect distribution of wealth proceeds solely from the theory of the division of labor, preached by men of art and science for selfish purposes. Science, defending the division of labor as an unchangeable law, sees that the distribution of wealth based upon this division is incorrect and pernicious, and asserts that its activity, which recognizes the division of labor, will set all right again, and lead men to happiness. It appears, then, that some men utilize the labor of others, but if they will only continue to do this for a long time, and on a still larger scale, then this incorrect distribution of wealth, that is, utilizing of other men's labor, will vanish. Men are standing by an ever-increasing spring of water, and are busy turning it aside from thirsty men, and then they assert that it is they who produce this water, and that soon there will be so much of it that everybody will have enough and to spare. And this water, which has been running unceasingly and nourishing all mankind, is not only not the result of the activity of those who, standing at its source, turn it aside, but it runs and spreads itself in spite of the endeavors to stop it from doing so. There has always existed a true church. In other words, men united by the highest truth accessible to them at a certain epoch, but it has never been that church which gave herself out for such. And there have always been real art and science, but they were not those which call themselves now by these names. Men who consider themselves to be the representatives of art and science in a given period of time always imagine that they have been doing, are doing, and the important fact is that they are on the point of making wonderful things, and that beyond them there has never been any art or science. Thus it seemed to the sophists, to the scholiasts, alchemists, Kabbalists, Talmudists, and to our own scientific science, and to our artistic art. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. But science, art, you repudiate science, art. That is, you repudiate that by which mankind live. I am always hearing this. People choose this way to put aside my arguments altogether without analyzing them. He repudiates science and art. He wishes to turn men back again to the savage state. Why then should we listen to him or argue with him? But this is unjust. Not only do I not repudiate science, human reasonable activity, and art, the expression of this reasonable activity, but it is actually in the name of this reasonable activity and its expression that I speak what I do, in order that mankind may avoid the savage state towards which they are rapidly moving, owing to the false teaching of our time. Science and art are as necessary to men as food, drink, and clothes, even still more necessary than these. But they become such, not because we decide that what we call science and art are necessary, but because they are truly necessary to men. Now, if I should prepare hay for the bodily food of men, my idea that hay is food would not make it to be so. I cannot say, "Why do you not eat hay when it is your necessary food?" Food is indeed necessary, but perhaps what I offer is not food at all. This very thing has happened with our science and art, and to us it seems that when we add to a Greek word the termination logi, and call this science, it will be science indeed. And if we call an indecency, like the painting of naked women, by the Greek word choreography, and term it art, it will be art indeed. But however much we may say this, the business which we are about, in counting up the insects, and chemically analyzing the contents of the Milky Way, in painting water nymphs and historical pictures, in writing novels, and in composing symphonies, this, our business, will not become science or art until it is willingly accepted by those for whom it is being done. Till now it has not been accepted. If some men only were allowed to prepare food, and all others were either forbidden to do it, or be rendered incapable of producing it, I dare say that the quality of the food would deteriorate. If the men who had the exclusive privilege of producing food were Russian peasants, then there would be no other food than black bread, kvass, potatoes, and onions, which they are fond of, and which is agreeable to them. The same would be the case with that highest human activity in art and science, if their exclusive privilege were appropriated by one caste. With this difference only, that in bodily food there cannot be too great digressions from the natural. Bread as well as onions, though unsavory food, is still eatable, but in mental food there may be great digressions, and some men may, for a very long time, feed upon an unnecessary, or even hurtful and poisonous mental food. They themselves may slowly kill themselves with opium or with spirits, and this sort of food they may offer to the masses of the people. This very thing has happened to us, and it has happened because men of art and science are in privileged conditions, because art and science in our world are not that mental activity of all mankind, without any exception, who separate their best powers for the service of art and science, but it is the activity of a small company of men, having the monopoly of these occupations, and calling themselves scientists and artists, and therefore they have perverted the very conceptions of art and science, and lost the sense of their own calling, and are merely occupied in amusing a small company of parasites, and saving them from burdensome dullness. Since men have existed, they have always had science in the plainest and largest sense of the word. Science, as the sum of all human information, has always been in existence, and without it life is not conceivable, and there is no necessity whatever either to attack or to defend it. But the fact is this, that the reason of this knowledge is so various, so much information of all kinds enters into it, from information how to obtain iron, up to the knowledge about movements of the celestial bodies, that man would be lost among all this varied information, if he had no clue to help him to decide which of all these kinds of information is more important, and which less. Therefore, the highest wisdom of men has always consisted in finding out the clue whereby to arrange the information of men, and to decide what kinds of information are more, and what are less, important. This which has directed all other knowledge, men have always called science in the strictest sense of the word. Such science has always been, up to the present time, in human societies which have left the savage state behind them. Since mankind has existed, teachers have appeared in every nation to form science in this strict sense, the science about what it is most necessary for men to know. The object of this science has always been the inquiry as to what was the destiny, and therefore the true welfare, of each man and of all men. This science has served as a clue to determine the importance and the expression of all other sciences. Such information and art as cooperated with the science of man's destiny and welfare were considered highest in public opinion. Such was the science of Confucius, Buddha, Moses, Socrates, Christ, Mohammed. Science such as it has been understood by all men, save our own circle of so-called educated people. Such a science has not only always occupied the first place, but it is the one science which has determined the importance of other sciences, and this, not at all because so-called learned men of our time imagine that it is only deceitful priests and teachers of this science who have given it such an importance, but because, as, indeed, everyone can learn by his own inward experience, without the science of man's destiny and welfare, there cannot be any determining of other values, or any choice of art and science for man. And, therefore, there cannot be any study of science, for there are innumerable quantities of subjects to which science may be applied. I italicize the word innumerable, as I use it in its exact value. Without knowledge as to what constitutes the calling and welfare of all men, all other arts and sciences become, as is really the case with us at present, only an idle and pernicious amusement. Mankind have been living long, and they have never been living without a science relative to the calling and welfare of men. It is true that the science of the welfare of men, to a superficial observation, appears to be different with Buddhists, Brahmins, Hebrews, Christians, with the followers of Confucius and those of Lao Tzu, though one need only reflect on these teachings in order to see their essential unity. Where men have left the savage state behind them, we find this science. And now, of a sudden, it turns out that modern men have decided that this very science, which has been till now the guide of all human information, is the obstacle in the way of everything. Men build houses. One architect makes one estimate, another makes a second, and so on. The estimates are a little different, but they are separately correct, and everyone sees that, if each estimate is fulfilled, the house will be erected. Such architects are Confucius, Buddha, Moses, Christ. And now certain men come and assure us that the chief thing to come by is the absence of any estimate, and that men ought to build anyhow according to eyesight. And this anyhow these men call the most exact science, as the Pope terms himself the most holy. Men deny every science, the most essential science of men's calling and welfare, and this denial of science they call science. Since men have existed, great intellects have always appeared, which, in the struggle with the demands of their reason and conscience, have put to themselves questions concerning the calling and welfare not only of themselves individually, but of every man. What does that power, which created me, require from me, and from each man? And what am I to do in order to satisfy the craving engrafted in me for a personal and a common welfare? They have asked themselves, I am a whole, and a part of something unfathomable, infinite. What are to be my relations to other parts similar to me, to men, and to the whole? And from the voice of conscience, and from reason, and from consideration on what men have said who lived before, and from contemporaries who have asked themselves the same questions, these great teachers have deduced teachings, plain, clear, intelligible to all men, and always such as can be put into practice. Such men were of the first, second, third, and all magnitudes. The world is full of such men. All living men put to themselves the question, how am I to reconcile my own demands for personal life with conscience and reason, which demand the common good of all men? And out of this common travail new forms of life are evolved slowly, but unceasingly, satisfying more and more the demands of reason and conscience. And of a sudden a new caste of men appears, who say, "Oh, these are nonsense, and are to be left behind." This is the deductive way of thinking, though wherein lies the difference between the inductive and the deductive way of thinking, nobody ever has been able to understand. And this is also the method of the theological and metaphysical periods. All that men have understood by inward experience, and have related to each other concerning the consciousness of the law of their own life, functional activity in their cant phrase, all that from the beginning of the world has been done in this direction by the greatest intellects of mankind, all of these are trifles, having no weight whatever. According to this new teaching, you are the cell of an organism, and the problem of your reasonable activity consists in trying to ascertain your functional activity. In order to ascertain this, you must make observations outside yourself. The fact that you are a cell which thinks, suffers, speaks, and understands, and that for that very reason you can inquire of another similar speaking, suffering cell, whether he or she suffers and rejoices in the same way as yourself, and that thus you may verify your own experience, and the fact that you may make use of what the speaking cells, who lived and suffered before you, wrote on the subject, and your knowledge that millions of cells agreeing with what the past cells have written confirm your own experience, that you yourself are a living cell, who always, by a direct inward experience, apprehend the correctness or incorrectness of your own functional activity. All this means nothing, we are told. It is all a false and evil method. The true scientific method is this. If you wish to learn in what your functional activity consists, what is your destiny and welfare, and what the destiny of mankind, and of the whole world, then first you must cease to listen to the voice and demands of your conscience and of your reason, which manifest themselves inwardly to you and to your fellow men. You must leave off believing all that the great teachers of humanity have said about their own conscience and reason, and you must consider all this to be nonsense, and begin at the beginning. And in order to begin from the beginning, you have to observe through a microscope the movements of amoebae and the cells of tapeworms. Or, still easier, you must believe everything that people with the diploma of infallibility may tell you about them. And observing the movements of these amoebae and cells, or reading what others have seen, you must ascribe to these cells your own human feelings and calculations as to what they desire, what are their tendencies, their reflections and calculations, their habits. And from these observations, in which each word contains some mistake of thought or expression, according to analogy, you must deduce what is your own destiny, and what that of other cells similar to you. In order to be able to understand yourself, you must study not merely the tapeworm which you see, but also microscopic animalcules which you cannot see, and the transformation from one set of things into another, which neither you nor anybody else has ever seen, and which you certainly will never see. The same holds good with art. Wherever a true science has existed, it has been expressed by art. Since men have existed, they have always separated out of all their activities, from their varied information, the chief expression of science, the knowledge of man's destination and welfare. And art, in the strict sense of the word, has been the expression of this. Since men have existed, there have always been persons particularly sensitive to the teaching of man's welfare and destiny, who have expressed in word, and upon psaltery and symbols, their human struggle with deceit which led them aside from their true destiny, and their sufferings in this struggle, their hopes about the victory of good, their despair about the triumph of evil, and their raptures in expectation of coming welfare. Since men have existed, the true art, that which has been valued most highly by men, had no other destiny than to be the expression of science on man's destiny and welfare. Always down to the present time, art has served the teaching of life, afterwards called religion, and it has only been this art which men have valued so highly. But contemporaneously with the fact that in place of the science of man's destiny and welfare appears the science of universal knowledge, since science lost its own sense and meaning, and true science has been scornfully called religion, true art, as an important activity of men, has disappeared. As long as the Church existed, and taught men's calling and welfare, art served the Church and was true. But from the moment it left the Church, and began to serve a science which served everything it met, art lost its meaning, and, notwithstanding its old-fashioned claims, and a stupid assertion that art serves merely art itself and nothing else, it has turned out to be a trade which procures luxuries for men, and unavoidably mixes itself with choreography, culinary art, hairdressing, and cosmetics, the producers of which may call themselves artists with as much right as the poets, painters, and musicians of our day. Looking back, we see that during thousands of years, from among thousands of millions of men who have lived, there came forth a few like Confucius, Buddha, Solon, Socrates, Solomon, Homer, Isaiah, David. True artist-producers of spiritual food seem to appear seldom among men, notwithstanding the fact that they appear, not from one caste only, but from among all men. And it is not without cause that mankind have always so highly valued them. And now it turns out that we have no longer any need of all these former great factors of art and science. Now, according to the law of the division of labor, it is possible to manufacture scientific and artistic factors almost mechanically. And in the space of 10 years we shall manufacture more great men of art and science than have been born among all men from the beginning of the world. Nowadays there is a trade corporation of learned men and artists, and by an improved way they prepare all the mental food which is wanted by mankind. And they have prepared so much of it, that there need no longer be any remembrance of the old producers, not only of the very ancient, but also of the more recent. All their activity, we are told, was the activity of the theological and metaphysical period. All had to be destroyed, and the true mental activity began some 50 years ago. And in these 50 years we have manufactured so many great men, that in a German university there are more of them than have been in the whole world. And of sciences we have manufactured a great number too, for one need only put to a Greek word the termination logi, and arrange the subject according to ready-made paragraphs, and the science is created. We have thus manufactured so many sciences, that not only cannot one man know them all, but he cannot even remember all their names. These names alone would fill a large dictionary, and every day new sciences come into existence. In this respect we are like that Finnish teacher who taught the children of a landowner the Finnish language instead of the French. He taught very well, but there was one drawback, that nobody, except himself, understood it. We have learned everything very well, but the pity of it is that nobody but ourselves understands it, and that everybody else considers it good-for-nothing nonsense. But to this also there is an explanation. Men do not understand all the utility of the scientific science, because they are still under the influence of the theological period of knowledge, that stupid period when all the people of the Hebrew race, as well as the Chinese and Indians and Greeks, understood everything spoken to them by their great teachers. But whatever may be the cause, the fact is this, that art and science have always existed among mankind, and when they really existed, they were necessary and intelligible to all men. We are busy about something which we call art and science, and it turns out that what we are busy about is neither necessary nor intelligible to men, so that we have no right to give the name of art or science to our doings. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. But it is said to me, You only give another narrower definition of art and science, which science does not agree with, but even this does not exclude them, and notwithstanding all you say, there still remains the scientific and art activities of men like Galileo, Bruno, Homer, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Wagner, and other learned men and artists of lesser magnitude who have devoted all their lives to art and science. Usually this is said in the endeavor to establish a link, which in other cases they disown, to connect the activity of the former learned men and artists with the modern ones, trying to forget that new principle of the division of labor, by reason of which art and science now occupy a privileged position. First of all, it is not possible to establish any such connection between the former factors and the modern ones. Even as the holy life of the first Christian has nothing in common with the lives of popes, thus the activity of men like Galileo, Shakespeare, Beethoven, has nothing in common with the activities of men like Tyndall, Hugo, and Wagner. As the Holy Fathers would have denied any connection with the popes, so the ancient factors of science would have denied any relationship with the modern ones. Secondly, owing to that importance which art and science ascribe to themselves, they have established a very clear standard by means of which we are able to determine whether they do or do not fulfill their destiny, and we therefore decide, not without proofs, but according to their own standard, whether that activity which calls itself art and science has, or has not, any right thus to call itself. Though the Egyptians, or Greek priests, performed mysteries known to none but themselves, and said that these mysteries included all art and science, I could not, on the ground of the asserted utility of these to the people, ascertain the reality of their science, because this said science, according to their ipse dixit, was a supernatural one. But now we all have a very clear and plain standard, excluding everything supernatural. Art and science promise to fulfill the mental activity of mankind, for the welfare of society, or even of the whole of mankind. Therefore we have a right to call only such activity art and science which has this aim in view, and attains it. And therefore, however those learned men and artists may call themselves, who excogitate the theory of penal laws, of state laws, and of the laws of nations, who invent new guns and explosive substances, who compose obscene operas and operettas, or similarly obscene novels, we have no right to call such activity the activity of art and science, because this activity has not in view the welfare of the society, or of mankind, but on the contrary is directed to the harm of men. In like manner, however these learned men may call themselves, who in their simplicity are occupied during all their lives with the investigations of the microscopic animalcule, and of telescopical and spectral phenomena, or those artists who, after having carefully investigated the monuments of old times, are busy writing historical novels, making pictures, concocting symphonies and beautiful verses, all these men, notwithstanding all their zeal, cannot, according to the definition of their own science, be called men of science or art. First, because their activity in science for the sake of science, and of art for art, has not in view man's welfare, and, secondly, because we do not see any results of these activities for the welfare of society or mankind. The fact that sometimes something useful or agreeable for some men comes of their activities by no means gives us any right, according to their own scientific definition, to consider them to be men of art and science. In like manner, however those men may call themselves who excogitate the application of electricity to lighting, heating, and motion, or who invent some new chemical combinations producing dynamite or fine colors, men who correctly play Beethoven's symphonies, who act on the stage, or paint portraits well, domestic pictures, landscapes, and other pictures, who compose interesting novels, the object of which is merely to amuse rich people. The activity of these men cannot be called art and science, because this activity is not directed, like the activity of the brain in the organism, to the welfare of the whole, but is guided merely by personal gain, privileges, money, which one obtains for the inventing and producing of so-called art. Therefore, this activity cannot possibly be separated from other covetous, personal activity which adds agreeable things to life, as the activity of innkeepers, jockeys, milliners, prostitutes, and so on, because the activity of the first, the second, and the last do not come under the definition of art and science, on the ground of the division of labor, which promises to serve for the welfare of all mankind. The scientific definition of art and science is a correct one, but, unluckily, the activity of modern art and science does not come under it. Some produce directly hurtful things, others useless things, and a third party invents trifles fit only for the use of rich people. They may all be very good persons, but they do not fulfill what they have taken upon themselves to fulfill, according to their own definition, and therefore they have as little right to call themselves men of art and science as the modern clergy, who do not fulfill their duties, have right to consider themselves the bearers and teachers of divine truth. It is not difficult to understand why the factors of modern art and science have not fulfilled their calling, and cannot fulfill it. They do not fulfill it because they have converted their duty into a right. The scientific and art activities, in their true sense, are fruitful only when they ignore their rights and know only their duties. Mankind value this activity so highly only because it is a self-denying one. If men are really called to serve others by mental labor, they will have to suffer in performing this labor, because it is only by suffering that spiritual fruit is produced. Self-denying and suffering are the lot and portion of a thinker and an artist, because their object is the welfare of men. Men are wretched, they suffer and go to ruin. One cannot wait and lose one's time. A thinker and an artist will never sit on the heights of Olympus, as we are apt to imagine. He must suffer in company with men in order to find salvation or consolation. He will suffer because he is constantly in anxiety and agitation. He might have found out and told what would give happiness to men, might have saved them from suffering, and he has neither found it out nor said it, and tomorrow it may be too late. He may die. And therefore suffering and self-sacrifice will always be the lot of the thinker and the artist. He who is brought up in an establishment where learned men and artists are created, but in reality they create only destroyers of art and science, and who obtains a diploma and is well provided for life, will not become a thinker or an artist. But he who would gladly abstain from thinking, and from expressing that which is engrafted in his soul, but which he dare not overlook, being drawn to it by two irresistible powers, his own inward impulse, and the wants of men. Thinkers and artists cannot be sleek, fat men enjoying themselves in self-conceit. Spiritual and mental activity, and their expressions, are really necessary for others, and are the most difficult of men's callings, a cross, as it is called in the Gospel. The only one certain characteristic of the presence of a calling is this self-denying, the sacrifice of one's self, in order to manifest the power engrafted in man for the benefit of others. To teach how many insects there are in the world, and to observe the spots on the sun, to write novels and operas, can be done without suffering. But to teach men their welfare, which entirely consists in self-denial and in serving others, and to express this teaching powerfully, cannot be done without self-denial. The Church existed in her purity as long as her teachers endured patiently and suffered, but as soon as they became fat and sleek, their teaching activity ended. Formerly, say the people, priests were of gold and chalices of wood. Now chalices are of gold and priests of wood. It was not in vain that Jesus Christ died on a cross. It is not in vain that sacrifice and suffering conquer everything. As for our art and sciences, they are provided for. They have diplomas, and everybody only thinks about how to provide still better for them. That is, to make it impossible for them to serve men. A true art and a true science have two unmistakable characteristics. The first, an interior one, that a minister of art or science fulfills his calling not for the sake of gain, but with self-denial. And the second, an exterior one, that his productions are intelligible to all men, whose welfare he is aiming at. Whatever men may consider to be their destiny and welfare, science will be the teacher of this destiny and welfare, and art the expression of this teaching. The laws of Solon, of Confucius, are science. The teachings of Moses, of Christ, are science. The temples in Athens, the Psalms of David, church worship, are art. But finding out the fourth dimension of matter, and tabulating chemical combinations, and so on, have never been and never will be science. The place of true science is occupied in our time by theology and law. The place of true art is occupied by the church and state ceremonies in which nobody believes, and which are not considered seriously by anybody, while that which with us is called art and science is only the production of idle minds and feelings, desirous to stimulate similarly idle minds and feelings, and unintelligible and dumb for the people, because they have not their welfare in view. Since we have known the lives of men, we have always and everywhere found a ruling false doctrine, calling itself science, which does not show men the true meaning of life, but rather hides it from them. So it was among the Egyptians, the Indians, the Chinese, and partially among the Greeks, (sophists), and among the mystics, Gnostics, and Kabbalists, in the Middle Ages in theology, scholasticism, alchemy, and so on down to our days. How fortunate indeed we are to be living in such a peculiar time, when that mental activity which calls itself science is not only free from errors, but, we are assured, is in a state of peculiar progress. Does not this good fortune come from the fact that man cannot and will not see his own deformities? While of the sciences of theologians, and that of Kabbalists, nothing is left but empty words, why should we be so particularly fortunate? The characteristics of our times and of former times are quite similar. There is the same self-conceit and blind assurance that we only are on the true way, and that only with us true knowledge begins. There are the same expectations that we shall presently discover something very wonderful, and there is the same exposure of our error, in the fact that all our wisdom remains with us, while the masses of the people do not understand it, and neither accept nor need it. Our position is a very difficult one, but why should we not look it in the face? It is time to come to our senses, and to look more closely to ourselves. We are, indeed, nothing but scribes and Pharisees who, sitting in Moses' seat, and having the key of the kingdom of God, do not enter themselves, and refuse entrance to others. We, priests of art and science, are most wretched deceivers, who have much less right to our position than the most cunning and depraved priests ever had. For our privileged position there is no excuse whatever. We have taken up this position by a kind of swindling, and we retain it by deceit. Pagan priests, the clergy, Russian as well as Roman Catholic, however depraved they may have been, had rights to their position, because they professed to teach men about life and salvation. And we, who have cut the ground from under their feet, and proved to men that they were deceivers, we have taken their place, and not only do not teach men about life, we even acknowledge that there is no necessity for them to learn. We suck the blood of the people, and for this we teach our children Greek and Latin grammars, so that they also may continue the same parasitic life which we are living. We say, there have been castes, we will abolish them. But what means the fact that some men and their children work, and other men and their children do not work? Bring a Hindu who does not know our language, and show him the Russian and the European lives of many generations, and he will recognize the existence of two important definite castes, of working people and of non-working people, as they are in existence in his own country. As in his country, so also among us, The right of not working is acquired through a peculiar initiation, which we call art and science, and education generally. It is this education, and the perversions of reason associated with it, that have brought to us this wonderful folly, whence it has come to pass that we do not see what is so plain and certain. We are eating up the lives of our brethren, and consider ourselves to be Christians, humane, educated, and quite in the right. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. What is to be done? What must we do? This question, which includes acknowledgment of the fact that our life is bad and unrighteous, and at the same time hints that there is no possibility of changing it, this question I hear everywhere, and therefore I chose it for the title of my work. I have described my own sufferings, my search, and the answer which I have found to this question. I am a man like others, and if I distinguish myself from an average man of my own circle in anything, it is chiefly in the fact that I, more than this average man, have served and indulged the false teaching of our world, that I have been more praised by the men of the prevalent school of teaching, and that therefore I am more depraved, and have gone farther astray than most of my fellows. Therefore I think that the answer to this question which I have found for myself will do for all sincere persons who will put the same question to themselves. First of all, to the question, what is to be done? I answer that I must neither deceive other men nor myself, that I must not be afraid of the truth, whatever the result may be. We all know what it is to deceive other men, and notwithstanding this we do deceive from morning to evening. Not at home, when I am in. Very glad, when I am not at all glad. Esteemed, when I do not esteem. I have no money, when I have it, and so on. We consider the deception of others to be evil, particularly a certain kind of deception, but we are not afraid to deceive ourselves. Yet the worst direct lie to men, seeing its result, is nothing in comparison with that lie to ourselves, according to which we shape our lives. Now, this very lie we must avoid, if we wish to be able to answer the question, what is to be done? Indeed, how am I to answer the question as to what is to be done, when everything I do, all my life, is based upon a lie, and I carefully give out this lie to others and to myself as truth? Not to lie, in this sense, means to be not afraid of truth, not to invent excuses, and not to accept excuses invented by others in order to hide from one's self the deductions of reason and conscience, not to be afraid of contradicting all our surroundings, and of being left alone with reason and conscience, not to be afraid of that condition to which truth and conscience lead us. However dreadful it may be, it cannot be worse than that which is based upon deceit. To avoid lying, for men in our privileged position of mental labor, means not to be afraid of truth. Perhaps we owe so much that we should never be able to pay it all, but however much we may owe, we must make out our bill. However far we have gone astray, it is better to return than to continue straying. Lying to our fellows is always disadvantageous. Every business is always more directly done by truth than by lies, and more quickly, too. Lying to other men makes matters only more complicated, and retards the decision. But lying to one's self, which is given out to be the truth, entirely ruins the life of man. If a man considers a wrong road to be a right one, then his every step leads him only farther from his aim. A man who has been walking for a long time on a wrong road may find out for himself, or be told by others, that his road is a wrong one. But if he, being afraid of the thought how far he has gone astray, tries to assure himself that he may, by following this wrong course, still come across the right one, then he will certainly never find it. If a man becomes afraid of the truth, and, on seeing it, will not acknowledge it, but accepts falsehood for truth, then this man will never learn what is to be done. We, not only rich men, but men in a privileged position, so-called educated men, have gone so far astray that we require either a firm resolution or very great sufferings on our false way to bring us to our senses again, and to recognize the lie by which we live. I became aware of the lie of our life, thanks to those sufferings to which my wrong road led me, and, having acknowledged the error of the way on which I was bent, I had the boldness to go, first in theory, then in reality, wherever my reason and conscience led me, without any deliberation as to whither they were tending. I was rewarded for this boldness. All the complex, disjointed, intricate, and meaningless phenomena of life surrounding me became of a sudden clear, and my position among these phenomena, formerly so strange and vile, became of a sudden natural and easy. In this new position my activity has exactly determined itself, but it is quite a different activity from that which appeared possible to me before. It is a new activity, far more quiet, affectionate, and joyous. The very thing which frightened me before now attracts me. Therefore, I think that everyone who sincerely puts to himself the question, "What is to be done?" and in answering this question does not lie or deceive himself, but goes wherever his reason and conscience may lead him, that man has already answered the question. If he will only avoid deceiving himself, he will find out what to do, where to go, and how to act. There is only one thing which may hinder him in finding an answer. That is too high an estimate of himself and of his own position. So it was with me. And therefore the second answer to the question, "What is to be done?" resulting from the first, consisted for me in repenting, in the full meaning of this word. That is, entirely changing the estimate of my own position and activity. Instead of considering such to be useful and of importance, we must come to acknowledge it to be harmful and trifling. Instead of considering ourselves educated, we must come to see our ignorance. Instead of imagining ourselves to be kind and moral, we must acknowledge that we are immoral and cruel. Instead of seeing our importance, we must see our own insignificance. I say that besides avoiding lying to myself, I had moreover to repent, because, though the one results from the other, the wrong idea about my great importance was so much a part of my own nature that until I had sincerely repented, and had put aside that wrong estimate of myself, I did not see the enormity of the lie of which I had been guilty. It was only when I repented, that is, left off considering myself to be a peculiar man, and began to consider myself to be like all other men, it was then that my way became clear to me. Before this I was not able to answer the question, "What is to be done?" because the very question itself was put incorrectly. Before I repented, I had put the question thus: "What activity should I choose? I, the man with the education and talents I have acquired. How can I compensate by this education and these talents for what I have been taking away from the people?" This question was a false one, because it included the wrong idea of my not being like other men, but a peculiar man, called to serve other men with those talents and that education which I had acquired in 40 years. I had put the question to myself, but in reality I had already answered it in advance, by having determined beforehand that I was called upon to serve men by the kind of activity agreeable to myself. I really asked myself, how can I, so fine a writer, one so very well informed, and with such talents, how can I utilize those talents for the benefit of mankind? But the question ought to have been put thus, as it would have to be put to a learned rabbi who had studied all the Talmud and knew the exact number of letters in the Holy Scripture and all the subtleties of his science. What can I do who, from unlucky circumstances, have lost my best years in study instead of accommodating myself to labor, in learning the French language, the piano, grammar, geography, law, poetry, in reading novels, romances, philosophical theories, and in performing military exercises? What can I do, who have passed the best years of my life in idle occupations, depraving the soul? What can I do, notwithstanding these unlucky conditions of the past, in order to requite these men who, during all this time, have fed and clothed me, and who still continue to feed and to clothe me? If the question had been put thus, after I had repented, what can I, so ruined a man, do? The answer would have been easy. First of all, I must try to get my living honestly, that is, learn not to live upon the shoulders of others. And while learning this, and after I have learned it, to try on every occasion to be of use to men, with my hands and with my feet, as well as with my brain and my heart, and with all of me that is wanted by men. Therefore I say that for one of my own circle, besides avoiding lying to others and ourselves, it is further necessary to repent, to lay aside pride about our education, refinement, and talents, not considering ourselves to be benefactors of the people, advanced men, who are ready to share our useful acquirements with the people, but acknowledging ourselves to be entirely guilty, ruined, good-for-nothing men, who desire to turn over a new leaf, and not to be benefactors of the people, but to cease to offend and to humiliate them. Very often good young people, who sympathize with the negative part of my writings, put to me the question, "What must I do then? What have I, who have finished my study in the university, or in some other high establishment, what have I to do in order to be useful?" These young people ask the question, but, in the depths of their souls, they have already decided that the education which they have received is their great advantage, and that they wish to serve the people by this very advantage. Therefore there is one thing which they do not do: honestly and critically examine what they call their education, asking themselves whether it is a good or a bad thing. If they do this, they will be unavoidably led to decry their education, and to begin to learn anew, and this alone is what is wanted. They will never be able to answer the question as to what there is to be done, while they put it wrongly. The question should be put thus: how can I, a helpless, useless man, recognizing the misfortune of having lost my best years in studying the scientific Talmud, pernicious for soul and body, how can I rectify this mistake, and learn to serve men? But the question is always put thus: how can I, who have acquired so much fine information, how can I be useful to men with this my information? Therefore a man can never answer the question, what is to be done, until he leaves off deceiving himself and repents. And repentance is not dreadful, even as truth is not dreadful, but it is equally beneficent and fruitful of good. We need only accept the whole truth and fully repent in order to understand that in life no one has any rights or privileges, and that there is no end of duties, and no limits to them, and that the first and unquestionable duty of a man is to take part in the struggle with nature for his own life and for the lives of other men. And this acknowledgment of men's duty forms the essence of the third answer to the question, what is to be done? I have tried to avoid deceiving myself. I have endeavored to extirpate the last remnant of the false estimate of the importance of my education and talents, and to repent. But before answering the question, what is to be done, there stands a new difficulty. There are so many things to be done that one requires to know what is to be done in particular, and the answer to this question has been given me by the sincere repentance of the evil in which I have been living. What is to be done? What is there exactly to be done? Everybody keeps asking. And I, too, kept asking this while, under the influence of a high opinion of my own calling, I had not seen that my first and unquestionable business is to earn my living, clothing, heating, building, and so forth, and in doing this to serve others as well as myself, because, since the world has existed, the first and unquestionable duty of every man has been comprised in this. In this one business man receives, if he has already begun to take part in it, the full satisfaction of all the bodily and mental wants of his nature. To feed, clothe, take care of himself and of his family will satisfy his bodily wants. To do the same for others will satisfy his spiritual. Every other activity of man is only lawful when these have first been satisfied. In whatever department a man thinks his calling lies, whether in governing the people, in protecting his countrymen, in officiating at divine services, in teaching, in inventing the means of increasing the delights of life, in discovering the laws of the universe, in incorporating eternal truths in artistic images, the first and most unquestionable duty of a reasonable man will always consist in taking part in the struggle with nature for preserving his own life and the lives of other men. This duty must always rank first, because the most necessary thing for men is life, and therefore, in order to protect and to teach men, and to make their lives more agreeable, it is necessary to keep this very life. While by not taking part in the struggle, and by swallowing up the labor of others, other lives are destroyed, and it is folly and impossible to endeavor to serve men while destroying their lives. Man's duty to acquire the means of living through the struggle with nature will always be unquestionably the very first of all duties, because it is the law of life, the violation of which unavoidably brings with it a punishment by destroying the bodily or mental life of man. If a man, living alone, free himself from the duty of struggling with nature, he will be at once punished by the perishing of his body. But if a man free himself from this duty by compelling other men to fulfill it for him, in ruining their lives, he will be at once punished by the destruction of his reasonable life, that is, of the life which has a reasonable sense in it. I had been so perverted by my antecedents, and this first and unquestionable law of God or nature is so hidden in our present world, that the fulfilling of it had seemed to me strange, and I was afraid and ashamed of it, as if the fulfillment, and not the violation, of this eternal and unquestionable law were strange, unnatural, and shameful. At first it seemed to me that, in order to fulfill this law, some sort of accommodation was necessary, some established association of fellow thinkers, the consent of the family, and life in the country, not in town. Then I felt ashamed, as if I were putting myself forward in performing things so unusual to our life as bodily labor, and I did not know how to begin. But I needed only to understand that this was not some exclusive activity, which I have to invent and arrange, but that it was merely returning from the false condition in which I had lived to a natural one, merely rectifying that lie in which I had been living. I had only to acknowledge all this, and all the difficulties vanished. It was not at all necessary to arrange and accommodate anything, nor to wait for the consent of other people, because everywhere, in whatever condition I was, there were men who fed, dressed, and warmed me as well as themselves, and everywhere, under all circumstances, if I had sufficient time and strength, I was able to do these things for myself and for them. Nor could I feel a false shame in performing actions unusual and strange to me, because, in not doing so, I already experienced not a false, but a real shame. Having come to this conclusion, and to the practical deduction from it, I have been fully rewarded for not having been afraid of the deductions of reason, and for having gone where they led me. Having come to this practical conclusion, I was struck by the facility and simplicity of the solution of all those problems which had formerly seemed to me so difficult and complicated. To the question, "What have we to do?" I received a very plain answer. Do first what is necessary for yourself. Arrange all you can do by yourself, your tea-urn, stove, water, and clothes. To the question, would not this seem strange to those who had been accustomed to do all this for me? It appeared that it was strange only for about a week, and after a week it seemed more strange for me to return to my former condition. In answer to the question, is it necessary to organize this physical labor, to establish a society in a village upon this basis. It appeared that it was not at all necessary to do all this, that if the labor does not aim at rendering idleness possible, and at utilizing other men's labor, as is the case with men who save up money, but merely the satisfying of necessities, then such labor will naturally induce people to leave towns for the country, where this labor is most agreeable and productive. There was also no need to establish a society, because a working man will naturally associate with other working people. In answer to the question, would not this labor take up all my time, and would it not deprive me of the possibility of that mental activity which I am so fond of, and to which I have become accustomed, and which in moments of doubt I consider to be useful? The answer will be quite an unexpected one. The energy of my mental activity increased in proportion to bodily exercise, being freed from all that was superfluous. In fact, having spent 8 hours in physical labor, half a day, which formerly I used to spend in endeavoring to struggle with dullness, there still remained for me 8 hours, out of which in my circumstances I required 5 for mental labor. And if I, a very prolific writer, who had been doing nothing but write during 40 years, and who had written 300 printed sheets, then if during these 40 years I had been doing ordinary work along with working people, and, not taking into consideration winter evenings and holidays, had been reading and learning during the 5 hours a day, and had written only on holidays 2 pages a day, and I have sometimes written 16 pages a day, I should have written the same 300 printed sheets in 14 years. A wonderful thing! A most simple arithmetical calculation, which every boy of 7 years of age may do, but which I had never done. Day and night have together 24 hours. We sleep 8 hours. There remain 16 hours. If any man labor mentally 5 hours a day, he will do a vast amount of business. What do we, then, do during the remaining 11 hours? So it appears that physical labor not only does not exclude the possibility of mental activity, but improves and stimulates it. In answer to the question whether this physical labor would deprive me of many innocent enjoyments proper to man, such as enjoyment of art, acquirement of knowledge, of social intercourse, and generally of the happiness of life, it was really quite the reverse. The more intense my physical labor, the more it approached that labor which is considered the hardest, to wit, agricultural labor, the more I acquired enjoyments and knowledge, and the closer and more affectionate was my intercourse with mankind, and the more happiness did I feel in life. In answer to the question, which I hear so often from men who are not quite sincere, what result can there be from such an awfully small drop in the sea? What is all my personal physical labor in comparison with the sea of labor which I swallow up? To this question also I received a very unexpected answer. It appeared that, as soon as I had made physical labor the ordinary condition of my life, at once the greatest part of the false and expensive habits and wants, which I had while I had been physically idle, ceased of themselves, without any endeavor on my part. To say nothing of the habit of turning day into night, and vice versa, of my bedding, clothes, my conventional cleanliness, which all became impossible and embarrassing when I began to labor physically. Both the quantity and the quality of my food was totally changed. Instead of the sweet, rich, delicate, complicated, and highly spiced food which I formerly liked, I now required and obtained plain food as being the most agreeable: sour cabbage soup, porridge, black bread, tea with a bit of sugar. So that, apart from the example of common working men satisfied with little, with whom I came in closer intercourse, my very wants themselves were gradually changed by my life of labor, so that in proportion to my growing accustomed to this labor, and acquiring the ways of it, my drop of physical labor became indeed more perceptible in the ocean of common labor, and in proportion as my labor grew more fruitful, my demands for other men's labor grew less and less, and, without effort or privation, my life naturally came nearer to that simple life of which I could not even have dreamed without fulfilling the law of labor. It became apparent that my former most expensive demands, the demands of vanity and amusement, were the direct result of an idle life. With physical labor, There was no room for vanity, and no need for amusement, because my time was agreeably occupied. And after weariness, simple rest while drinking tea, or reading a book, or conversing with the members of my family, was far more agreeable than the theatre, playing at cards, concerts, or large parties. In answer to the question, would not this unusual labor be hurtful to health, which is necessary in order that I may serve men, it appeared that, despite the positive assurance of eminent doctors that hard physical labor, especially at my age, might have the worst results, and that Swedish gymnastics, riding, and other expedients intended to supply the natural conditions of man would be far better, the harder I worked, the sounder, more cheerful, and kinder I felt myself. It became undoubtedly certain that even as all these inventions of the human mind, such as newspapers, theatres, concerts, parties, balls, cards, magazines, novels, are nothing but means to sustain the spiritual life of men outside its natural condition of labor for others, so in the same way all the hygienic and medical inventions of the human mind for the provision of food, drink, dwelling, ventilation, warming of rooms, clothes, medicines, mineral water, gymnastics, electric and other cures, are all merely means to sustain the bodily life of man outside of its natural conditions of labor, and all these are nothing else than an establishment hermetically closed, in which, by means of chemical apparatus, the evaporation of water for the plants is arranged, when you need only to open the window and do that which is natural, not for men alone, but to beasts too. In other words, having absorbed the food, and thus produced a charge of energy, to discharge it by muscular labor. All the profound study of hygiene and of the art of healing for the men of our circle are like the efforts of a mechanic who, having stopped all the valves of an overheated engine, should invent something to prevent this engine from bursting. When I had plainly understood all this, it seemed to me ridiculous that I, through a long series of doubt, research, and much thinking, had arrived at this extraordinary truth, that if man has eyes, they are to be seen through, ears to hear by, feet to walk with, and hands and back to work with, and that if man will not use these, his members, for what they are meant, then it will be the worse for him. I came to this conclusion, that with us, privileged people, the same thing has happened which happened to the horses of a friend of mine. The steward, who was not fond of horses, and did not understand anything about them, having received from his master's orders to prepare the best cobs for sale, chose the best out of the drove of horses, put them into the stable, fed them upon oats. But being over-anxious, he trusted them to nobody, neither rode them himself, nor drove nor led them. Of course, all these horses became good for nothing. The same has happened to us, with this difference, that you cannot deceive horses, and, in order not to let them out, they must be fastened in, while we are kept in unnatural and hurtful conditions by all sorts of temptations, which fasten and hold us as with chains. We have arranged for ourselves a life which is against the moral and physical nature of man, and we use all the powers of our mind in order to assure men that this life is the real one. All that we call culture, our science and arts for improving the delights of life, all these are only meant to deceive man's natural moral requirements. All that we call hygiene and the art of healing are endeavors to deceive the natural physical want of human nature. But these deceits have their limits, and we are come to these limits. If such be real human life, then it is better not to live at all, says the fashionable philosophy of Schopenhauer and Hartmann. If such is life, then it is better not to live at all, is the witness borne by the increasing number of suicides among the privileged classes. If such be life, it is better for future generations, too, not to live, says the indulgent healing art, and invents means to destroy women's fecundity. In the Bible, the law to human beings is expressed thus: "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread," and "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." The peasant Bondarev, who wrote an article about this, threw great light upon the wisdom of this sentence. During the whole of my life, two thinking men, Russians, have exercised a great influence over me. They have enriched my thoughts, and enlightened my contemplation of the world. These men were neither poets, nor learned men, nor preachers. They were two remarkable men, both now living, peasants, Sutaïev and Bondarev. But nous avons changé tout ça, as says one of Molière's personages, talking at random about the healing art, and saying that the liver is on the left side. We have changed all that. Men need not work. All work will be done by machines. And women need not bring forth children. The healing art will teach different means of avoiding this, for there are already too many people in the world. In the Kropivensky district, there wanders a ragged peasant, who during the war was a purchaser of bread for a commissary of stores. Having become acquainted with this functionary, and having seen his comfortable life, he became mad, and now thinks that he, too, can live as gentlemen do, without work, being provided for by the emperor. This peasant now calls himself the most serene Marshal Prince Blokhin, purveyor of war stores of all kinds. He says of himself that he has gone through all ranks, and for his services during the war he has to receive from the emperor an unlimited bank account, clothes, uniforms, horses, carriages, tea, servants, and all kinds of provision. When anybody asks him whether he would like to work a little, he only answers, "Oh, thanks, the peasants will attend to all that." When we say to him that the peasants also may not be disposed to work, he answers, "Machines have been invented to ease the labor of peasants. They have no difficulty in their business." When we ask him what he is living for, he answers, "To pass away the time." I always consider this man as a mirror. I see in him myself and all my class, to pass through all ranks in order to live to pass away the time, and to receive an unlimited bank account, while peasants attend to everything, and find it easy to do so because of the invention of machines. This is the exact form of the foolish belief of men of our class. When we ask, what have we particularly to do, we are in reality asking nothing but only asserting, not so sincerely indeed as the most serene Marshal Prince Blokhin, who had passed through all ranks and lost his mind, that we do not wish to do anything. He who has come to his senses cannot ask this, because from one side all that he makes use of has been done, and is being done, by the hands of men. On the other side, as soon as a healthy man has got up and breakfasted, he feels the inclination to work, as well with his feet as with his hands and brain. In order to find work, he has only not to restrain himself from labor. Only he who considers labor to be a shame, like the lady who asked her guest not to trouble herself to open the door, but to wait till she called a servant to do it, only such persons can ask what is there to be done in particular. The difficulty is not in inventing work. Everyone has enough to do for himself and for others, but in losing this criminal view of life, that we eat and sleep for our own pleasure, and in gaining that simple and correct view, in which every working person grows up, that man first of all is a machine which is charged with food, and that therefore it is shameful, difficult, and impossible to eat and not to work. That to eat and not to work is a most dangerous state, and as bad as incendiarism. It is necessary only to have this consciousness, and we shall find work, and this work will always be pleasant, and capable of satisfying all the wants of our soul and body. I picture to myself the whole matter thus. Every man's day is divided by his meals into 4 parts, or 4 stages as it is called by the peasants. First, before breakfast. Secondly, from breakfast to dinner. Thirdly, from dinner to poldnik, a slight evening meal between dinner and supper. And fourthly, from poldnik to night. The activity of man, to which he is drawn, is also divided into 4 kinds. First, the activity of the muscles, the labor of the hands, feet, shoulders, back, hard labor by which one perspires. Secondly, the activity of the fingers and wrists, the activity of skill and handicraft. Thirdly, the activity of the intellect and imagination. Fourthly, the activity of intercourse with other men. The goods which man makes use of may also be divided into 4 kinds. First, every man makes use of the productions of hard labor, bread, cattle, buildings, wells, bridges, and so on. Secondly, the productions of handicraft, clothes, boots, hardware, and so on. Thirdly, the productions of mental activity, science, art, and, fourthly, the intercourse with men, acquaintanceship, societies. I thought that it would be the best thing so to arrange the occupations of the day that one might be able to exercise all these four faculties, and to return all the four kinds of production of labor which one makes use of, so that the four parts of the day were devoted, first to hard labor, secondly to mental labor, thirdly to handicraft, fourthly to the intercourse with men. It would be good if one could so arrange his labor, but if it is not possible to arrange thus, one thing is important: to acknowledge the duty of laboring, the duty of making a good use of each part of the day. I thought that it would be only then that the false division of labor which now rules our society would disappear, and a just division would be established, which should not interfere with the happiness of mankind. I, for instance, have all my life been busy with mental work. I had said to myself that I have thus divided the labor, that my special work is writing, that is, mental labor, and all other works necessary for me I left to be done by other men, or rather compelled them to do it. But this arrangement, seemingly so convenient for mental labor, though unjust, became most inconvenient, especially for mental labor. I have been writing all my life, have accommodated my food, sleep, amusements, with reference to this special labor, and besides this work I did nothing. The results of which were, first, that I had been narrowing the circle of my observation and information, and often I had not any object to study, and therefore, having had to describe the life of men is a continual problem of every mental activity, I felt my ignorance, and had to learn and to ask about such things, which everyone not occupied with a special work knows. Secondly, it happened that when I sat down to write, I often had no inward inclination to write, and nobody wanted my writing for itself, that is, for my thoughts, but people merely wanted my name for profits in the magazines. I made great efforts to write what I could. Sometimes I did not succeed at all. Sometimes succeeded in writing something very bad, and I felt dissatisfied and miserable. So often and often weeks passed, during which I would eat, drink, sleep, warm myself, and do nothing, or do something of no use to anybody, i.e., commit the worst and meanest crime, scarcely ever committed by a man of the working class. But since I have acknowledged the necessity of physical labor as well as hard labor, and also that of handicraft, everything is quite different. My time is occupied, however humbly, but certainly in a useful way, and pleasantly and instructively for me. Therefore I, for the sake of my speciality, leave off this undoubtedly useful and pleasant occupation, only when I feel an inward want, or see a direct demand for my literary work, and this caused the quality, and therefore the usefulness and pleasantness, of my special labor to improve. Thus it has happened that my occupation with those physical works, which are necessary for me as well as for every man, not only do not interfere with my special activity, but are a necessary condition of the utility, quality, and pleasantness of this activity. A bird is so created that it is necessary for it to fly, to walk, to peck, to consider, and when it does all this, it is satisfied and happy. Then it is a bird. Exactly so with a man when he walks, turns over heavy things, lifts them up, carries them, works with his fingers, eyes, ears, tongue, brain. Then only is he satisfied. Then only is he a man. A man who has come to recognize his calling to labor will be naturally inclined to that change of labor which is proper for him for the satisfying of his outward and inward wants, and he will reverse this order only when he feels an irresistible impulse to some special labor, and when other men require this labor from him. The nature of labor is such that the satisfying of all men's wants requires that very alternation of different kinds of labor which renders labor easy and pleasant. Only the erroneous idea that labor is a curse could lead men to free themselves from some kinds of labor, that is, to seize other men's labor, requiring from other men that forced occupation with a special labor, which is called nowadays the division of labor. We have become so accustomed to our false conception of the arrangement of labor, that it seems to us that for a bootmaker, a machinist, a writer, a musician, It would be better to be freed from the labor proper to man. Where there is no violence over other men's labor, nor a false belief in the pleasure of idleness, no man will, for the sake of his special labor, free himself from physical labor necessary for the satisfying of his wants, because special occupation is not a privilege, but a sacrifice to a man's inclination, and for the sake of his brethren. A bootmaker in a village, having torn himself from his usual pleasant labor in the field, and having begun his labor of mending or making boots for his neighbors, deprives himself of a pleasant, useful labor in the field for the sake of others, only because he is fond of sewing, and knows that nobody will do it better than he does, and that people will be thankful to him. But he cannot wish to deprive himself of the pleasant alternation of labor for all his life. The same with the starosta, the machinist, the writer, the learned man. It is only to our perverted ideas that it seems, when the master sends his clerk to be a peasant, or government sentences one of its ministers to deportation, that they are punished and have been dealt with hardly. In reality they have had a great good done to them. That is, they have exchanged their heavy special work for a pleasant alternation of labor. In a natural society all is different. I know a commune where the people earn their living themselves. One of the members of this community was more educated than the rest, and they require him to deliver lectures, for which he has to prepare himself during the day, that he may be able to deliver them in the evening. He does it joyfully, feeling that he is useful to others and that he can do it well. But he grows tired of the exclusive mental labor, and his health suffers accordingly. The members of the community therefore pity him, and ask him to come and labor in the field again. For men who consider labor to be the essential thing and the joy of life, the ground, the basis of it, will always be the struggle with nature, not only in agricultural labor, but also in that of handicraft, mental work, and intercourse with men. The divergence from one or many of these kinds of labor, and specialties of labor, will be performed only when a man of special gifts, being fond of this work, and knowing that he performs it better than anybody else, will sacrifice his own advantage in order to fulfill the demands which others put directly to him. Only with such a view of labor, and the natural division of labor resulting from it, will that curse disappear which in our imagination we have put upon labor, and every labor will always be a joy, because man will do either an unquestionably useful, pleasant, and easy work, or will be conscious that he makes a sacrifice by performing a more difficult special labor for the good of others. But the division of labor is, it is said, more advantageous. Advantageous for whom? Is it more advantageous to make with all speed as many boots and cotton prints as possible? But who will make these boots and cotton prints? Men who from generation to generation have been making only pinheads? How, then, can it be more advantageous for people? If the object were to make as many cotton prints and pins as possible, it would be so. But the question is how to make people happy. The happiness of men consists in life, and life is in labor. How, then, can the necessity of painful, oppressing work be advantageous for men? If the question were only for the advantage of some men, without any consideration of the welfare of all, then it might be most advantageous for some men to eat others. They say it is savory. The thing most advantageous for all men is what I wish for myself, the greatest welfare and the satisfying of all my wants which are engrafted in me, those of body as well as those of soul, of conscience and of reason. Now for myself I have found that for my welfare and for the satisfying of these wants, I need only to be cured of the folly in which I, as well as the Krapivensky madman, have lived, consisting in the idea that gentlefolk need not work, and that all must be done for them by others, and that, producing nothing, I have to do only what is proper to man, satisfy my own wants. Having discovered this, I became persuaded that this labor for the satisfying of my own wants is divisible into various kinds of labor, each of which has its own charm, and is not only no burden, but serves as rest after some other labor. I have roughly divided labor, not in the least insisting on the propriety of such a division, into 4 parts parallel to the 4 parts of the laborer's day's work, divided by his meals, and thus I try to satisfy my wants. These are, then, the answers to the question, "What shall we do?" which I have found for myself. First, not to lie to myself. However far I have gone astray from that road of life which my reason shows to me, I must not be afraid of the truth. Secondly, to renounce my own righteousness, my own advantages, peculiarities, distinguishing me from others, and to own my guilt. Thirdly, to fulfill the eternal, unquestionable law of man, by laboring with all my being to struggle with nature, to sustain my own life, and the lives of others. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. I have now finished, having said all that concerns myself, but I cannot restrain my desire to say that which concerns everyone, and to verify my own deductions by several considerations. I wish to explain why I think that a great many of my own class must arrive where I myself am, and I must also speak of what will result if even a few men arrive there. In the first place, if men of our circle, our caste, will only seriously think the matter out themselves, the younger generation who seek their own personal happiness will become afraid of the ever-increasing misery of lives which obviously lead them to ruin. Scrupulous persons among us, if they would examine themselves more closely, will be terrified at the cruelty and unlawfulness of their own lives, and timid persons will be frightened at the danger of their mode of life. The misery of our lives. However we, rich men, may try to mend and to support, with the assistance of science and art, this our false life, it must become weaker every day, unhealthier, and more painful. With each year suicide, and the sin against the unborn babe, increase. With each year the new generations of our class grow weaker. With each year we feel more and more the increasing misery of our lives. It is obvious that on this road, with all its increase of the comforts and delights of life, of cures, artificial teeth and hair, and so on, there can be no salvation. This truth has become such a truism that in newspapers advertisements are printed about stomach powder for rich people, under the title Blessings of the Poor, where they say that only poor people have a good digestion, and the rich need help, and, among other things, this powder. You cannot ameliorate this matter by any kind of amusements, comforts, powders, but only by turning over a new leaf. The contradiction of our life with our conscience, however we may try to justify to ourselves our treason against mankind, all our justification falls to pieces before evidence. Around us people are dying from overwork and want, and we destroy the food, clothes, and labor of men merely to amuse ourselves. Therefore the conscience of a man of our circle, though he may have but a small remainder of it in his breast, cannot be stifled, and poisons all these comforts and charms of life which our suffering and perishing brethren procure for us. Not only does every conscientious man feel this himself, but he must feel it more acutely at present, because the best part of art and science, that part which still retains a sense of its high calling, constantly reminds him of his cruelty and of the unlawfulness of his position. The old secure justifications are all destroyed, and the new ephemeral justifications of the progress of science for science's sake, and art for art's sake, will not bear the light of plain common sense. The conscience of men cannot be calmed by new devices. It can be calmed only by turning over a new leaf, when there will be no longer any need for justification. The danger to our lives. However much we may try to hide from ourselves the plain and obvious danger of exhausting the patience of those whom we oppress, however much we may try to counteract this danger by all sorts of deceit, violence, and flattery, it grows day by day, hour by hour. It has long been threatening us, but now it is so ready that we are scarcely able to hold our course, as in a vessel tossed by a roaring and overflowing sea, a sea which will presently swallow us up in wrath. The workman's revolution, with its terrors of destruction and murder, not only threatens us, but we have already lived above it for the last 30 years, and it is only by various cunning devices that we have postponed the explosion. Such is the state in Europe, such is the state in Russia, and still worse there, because we have no safety valves. The classes who oppress the people, with the exception of the Tsar, have no longer any justification in the eyes of our people. They all keep up their position merely by violence, cunning, and expediency, i.e. skill. But the hatred towards us of the worst representatives of the people, and the contempt of us from the best, increases every hour. Among the Russian people a new word full of significance has been circulating during the last 3 or 4 years. By this word, which I never heard before, people are swearing in the streets, and by it they give us a definition: parasites. The hatred and contempt of the oppressed people are increasing, and the physical and moral strength of the richer classes are decreasing. The deceit which supports all is wearing out, and the rich classes have nothing wherewith to comfort themselves in this mortal danger. To return to the old order of things is impossible. To restore the old prestige is impossible. It only remains for those who are not willing to change the course of their lives and to turn over a new leaf, to hope that, during their lives, they may fare well enough, after which the people may do as they like. So think the blind crowd of the rich. But the danger ever increases, and the awful catastrophe comes nearer and nearer. There are 3 reasons which should prove to rich people the necessity of turning over a new leaf. First, desire for their own personal welfare and that of their families, which is not secured by the way in which rich people are living. Secondly, the inability to satisfy the voice of conscience, which is obviously impossible in the present condition of things. And thirdly, the threatening and constantly increasing danger to life, which cannot be met by any outward means. All these together ought to induce rich people to change their mode of life. This change alone would satisfy the desire of welfare and conscience, and would remove the danger. There is but one means of making such change: to leave off deceiving ourselves, to repent, and to acknowledge labor to be, not a curse, but the joyful business of life. To this it is replied, what will come out of the fact of my physical labor during 10, 8, or 5 hours, while thousands of peasants would gladly do it for the money which I have? The first good result would be that you will become livelier, healthier, sounder, kinder, and you will learn that real life from which you have hidden yourself, or which was hidden from you. The second good result will be that, if you have a conscience, it will not only cease to suffer as it now suffers when looking at the labor of men, the importance of which we always, from our ignorance, either increase or diminish, but you will constantly experience a joyful acknowledgment that with each day you are satisfying more and more the demands of your conscience, and are leaving behind you that awful state in which so much evil is accumulated in our lives, that we feel that we cannot possibly do any good in the world. You will experience the joy of free life, with the possibility of doing good to others. You will open for yourself a way into regions of the world of morality which have hitherto been shut to you. The third good result will be this, that, instead of constant fear of revenge upon your evil deeds, you will feel that you are saving others from this revenge, and are principally saving the oppressed from the cruel feeling of rancor and resentment. But it is generally said that it would be ridiculous if we, men of our stamp, with deep philosophical, scientific, political, artistic, ecclesiastical, social questions before us, we, state ministers, senators, academists, professors, artists, singers, we whose quarter hours are valued so highly by men, should spend our time in doing what? Cleaning our boots, washing our shirts, digging, planting potatoes, or feeding our chickens and cows and so on. In business which not only our house porter or our cook, but thousands of men besides who value our time, would be very glad to do for us. But why do we dress, wash, and comb our hair ourselves? Why do we walk, hand chairs to ladies, to our guests, open and shut the door, help people into carriages, and perform hundreds of actions which were formerly performed for us by our slaves? Because we consider that such may be done by ourselves, that they are compatible with human dignity, that is, human duty. The same holds good with physical labor. Man's dignity, his sacred duty, is to use his hands, his feet, for the purpose for which they were given him, to spend the swallowed food in work which produces the food, and not to be wasted by disuse, not merely that he may wash and clean them, and use them only for the purpose of stuffing food and cigarettes into his mouth. Such is the meaning of physical labor for every man in every society. But in our class, with the divergence from this law of nature came the misery of a whole circle of men. And for us, physical labor receives another meaning, the meaning of a preaching and a propaganda which divert the terrible evil which threatens mankind. To say that for an educated man, physical labor is a trifling occupation, is the same as to say, in the building of a temple, what importance can there be in putting each stone exactly in its place? Every great act is done under the conditions of quietness, modesty, and simplicity. One can neither plow, nor feed cattle, nor think, during a great illumination, or amid thundering of guns, nor while in uniform. Illumination, the roar of cannon, music, uniforms, cleanliness, brilliancy, which we usually connect with the idea of the importance of any act, are, on the contrary, tokens of the absence of importance in that act. Great, true deeds are always simple and modest. Such is also the greatest deed which is left to us to do, the solution of those awful contradictions in which we are living. The acts which solve these contradictions are modest, imperceptible, seemingly ridiculous acts, such as helping ourselves by physical labor and, if possible, helping others too. This is what we rich people have to do, if we understand the misery, wrong, and danger of the position in which we live. What will result from the circumstance that I, and another, and a third, and a 10th man, do not despise physical labor, but consider it necessary for our happiness, for the calming of our consciences, and for our safety? This will result from it, that 1, 2, 3, 10 men, coming into conflict with no one, without violence either of government or of revolution, will solve for themselves the problem which is before all the world, and which has appeared unsolvable, and they will solve it in such a way that life will become for them a good thing. Their consciences will be calm, and the evil which oppresses them will cease to be dreadful to them. Another effect will be this: other men, too, will see that the welfare which they have been looking for everywhere is quite near them, that seemingly unsolvable contradictions between conscience and the order of the world are solved in the easiest and pleasantest way, and that, instead of being afraid of the men surrounding them, they must have intercourse with them, and love them. The seemingly unsolvable economic and social questions are like the problem of Krylov's casket. The casket opened of itself, without any difficulty, but it will not open until men do the simplest and most natural thing, that is, open it. The seemingly unsolvable question is the old question of the utilizing some men's labor by others. This question in our time has found its expression in property. Formerly, other men's labor was used simply by violence, by slavery. In our time, it is being done by the means of property. In our time, property is the root of all evil, and of the sufferings of men who possess it, or are without it, and of all the remorse of conscience of those who misuse it, and of the danger from the collision between those who have it and those who have it not. Property is the root of all evil, and at the same time, property is that towards which all the activity of our modern society is directed, and that which directs the activity of the world. States and governments intrigue, make wars, for the sake of property, for the possession of the banks of the Rhine, of land in Africa, China, the Balkan Peninsula. Bankers, merchants, manufacturers, landowners, laborers use cunning, torment themselves, torment others, for the sake of property. Government functionaries, artisans, struggle, deceive, oppress, suffer for the sake of property. Courts of justice and police protect property. Penal servitude, prisons, all the terrors of so-called punishments, all is done for the sake of property. Property is the root of all evil, and now all the world is busy with the distribution and protecting of wealth. What, then, is property? Men are accustomed to think that property is something really belonging to man, and for this reason they have called it property. We speak indiscriminately of our own house and our own land. But this is obviously an error and a superstition. We know, and if we do not, it is easy to perceive, that property is only the means of utilizing other men's labor, and another's labor can by no means belong to me. It has nothing in common with the conception of property, a conception very exact and precise. Man has been, and will always call his own, that which is subject to his own will, and joined with his own consciousness. As soon as a man calls his own something which is not his body, but which he should like to be subject to his will as his body is, then he makes a mistake, and gets disappointment and suffering, and compels other people to suffer as well. Man calls his wife his own, his children, his slaves, his belongings his own too. But the reality always shows him his error, and he must either get rid of this superstition, or suffer and make others suffer. Now we, having nominally renounced the possessing of slaves, owing to money and to its exactment by the government, claim our right also to money, that is, to the labor of other men. But as to our claiming our wives as our property, or our sons, our slaves, our horses, this is pure fiction contradicted by reality, and which only makes those suffer who believe in it, because a wife or a son will never be so subject to my will as my body is. Therefore my own body will always remain the only thing I can call my true property. So also money, property, will never be real property, but only a self-deception and a source of suffering. And it is only my own body which will be my property, that which always obeys me, and is connected with my consciousness. It is only to us, who are so accustomed to call other things than our body our own, that such a wild superstition can appear to be useful for us, and without evil results. But we have only to reflect upon the nature of the matter to see how this, like every other superstition, brings with it only dreadful consequences. Let us take the most simple example. I consider myself my own, and another man like myself I consider my own too. I must understand how to cook my dinner. If I were free from the superstition of considering another man as my property, I should have been taught this art, as well as every other necessary to my real property, that is, my body. But now I have taught it to my imaginary property, and the result is that my cook does not obey me, does not wish to humor me, and even runs away from me, or dies, and I remain with an unsatisfied want, and have lost the habit of learning, and recognize that I have spent as much time in worry about this cook as I should have spent in learning the art of cooking for myself. The same is the case with property in buildings, clothes, wares, with property in the land, with property in money. Every imaginary property calls forth in me a non-corresponding want which cannot always be gratified, and deprives me of the possibility of acquiring for my true and sure property, my own body, that information, that skill, those habits, improvements, which I might have acquired. The result is always that I have spent, without gain to myself, to my true property, strength, sometimes my whole life, on that which has never been, and never could be, my property. I provide myself with an imaginary private library, a private picture gallery, private apartments, clothes, acquire my own money in order to purchase with it everything I want. And the matter stands thus, that I, being busy about this imaginary property, which is not and cannot be my property, however I may call it, and which is no object for activity, leave quite out of sight that which is my true property, upon which I may really labor, and which really may serve me, and which always remains in my power. Words have always a definite meaning until we purposely give them a false signification. What does property mean? Property means that which is given to me alone, which belongs to me alone exclusively, that with which I may always do everything I like, which nobody can take away from me, which remains mine to the end of my life, and which I ought to use in order to increase and to improve it. For every man such property is only himself. It is in this very sense that imaginary property is understood, that very property for sake of which, making it impossible for this imaginary property to become a real one, all the sufferings of this world exist. Wars, executions, judgments, prisons, luxury, depravity, murders, and the ruin of mankind. What, then, will result from the circumstance that 10 men plough, hew wood, make boots, not from necessity, but in acknowledgment that man needs work, and that the more he works, the better it will be for him? This will come out of it, that 10 men, or even one single man, by thought and in deed, will show men that this fearful evil from which they are suffering is not the law of their destiny, nor the will of God, nor any historical necessity, but is a superstition not at all strong or overpowering, but weak and null, which one need only leave off believing in, as in idols, in order to get rid of and to destroy it, even as a frail cobweb is swept away. Men who begin to work in order to fulfill the pleasant law of their lives, who work for the fulfillment of the law of labor, will free themselves from this superstition of property which is so full of misery, and then all these worldly establishments which exist in order to protect this imaginary property outside of one's own body will become not only unnecessary for them, but burdensome, and it will become clear to all that these institutions are not necessary, but pernicious, imaginary, and false conditions of life. For a man who considers labor not a curse, but a joy, property outside his own body, that is, the right or possibility of utilizing other men's labor, will be not only useless, but an impediment. If I am fond of cooking my dinner, and accustomed to do it, then the fact that another man will do it for me will deprive me of my usual business, and will not satisfy me so well as I have satisfied myself. And further, the acquirement of imaginary property will not be necessary for such a man. A man who considers labor to be his very life, fills up all his life with it, and therefore requires less and less the labor of others, in other words, as property to fill up his unoccupied time, and to embellish his life. If the life of a man is occupied by labor, he does not require many rooms, much furniture, various fine clothes. He does not require so much expensive food, or locomotion, or amusements. Especially a man who considers labor to be the business and the joy of his life will not seek to ease his own labor by utilizing that of others. A man who considers life to consist in labor will aim, in proportion as he acquires more skill, craft, and endurance, at having more and more work to do, to occupy all his time. For such a man, who sees the object of his life in labor, and not in the results of his labor in acquirement of property, there cannot be even a question about the instruments of labor. Though such a man will always choose the most productive instrument of labor, he will have the same satisfaction in working with the most unproductive. If he has a steam plough, he will plough with it. If he has not such, he will plough with a horse plough. If he has not this, he will plough with the plain Russian soka. If he has not even this, he will use a spade, and under any circumstances he will attain his aim. That is, will pass his life in labor useful to man, and therefore will have fullest satisfaction. The position of such a man, in exterior and interior circumstances, will be happier than the condition of a man who gives his life away to acquire property. According to exterior circumstances, he will never want, because men, seeing that he does not shirk work, will always try to make his labor most productive to them, as they arrange a mill by running water. And that his labor may be more productive, they will provide for his material existence, which they will never do for men who aim at acquiring property. The providing for material wants is all that a man requires. According to interior conditions, such a man will always be happier than he who seeks for property, because the latter will never get what he is aiming at, and the former in proportion to his strength. Even the weak, old, dying, according to the proverb, with a kored in his hands, will always receive full satisfaction, and the love and sympathy of men. One of the consequences of this will be that certain odd, half-insane persons will plough, make boots, and so on, instead of smoking, playing cards, and riding about, carrying their dullness with them, from one place to another, during the 10 hours which every brain worker has at his command. Another result will be that these silly people will demonstrate indeed that imaginary property for the sake of which men suffer and torment themselves and others is not necessary for happiness, and even impedes it, and is but a superstition, and that true property is only one's own head, hands, feet, and that, in order to utilize this true property usefully and joyfully, it is necessary to get rid of that false idea of property outside one's own body, on which we waste the best powers of our life. Another result will be that these men will demonstrate that when a man leaves off believing in imaginary property, then only will he make real use of his true property, his own body, which will yield him fruit 100-fold, together with happiness such as we have no idea as yet. And he will be a useful, strong, kind man, who will everywhere stand on his own feet, will be always a brother to everybody, will be intelligible to all, desired by all, and dear to all. Then men, looking at 10 such silly men, will understand what they have all to do to unfasten that dreadful knot in which they have all been tied by the superstition respecting property, and to get rid of the miserable condition under which they are now groaning, and from which they do not know how to free themselves. There is no reasoning which can so plainly demonstrate the unrighteousness of those who employ it as does this. The boatmen are dragging vessels against the stream. Is it possible that there could be found a stupid boatman who would refuse to do his part in dragging, because he alone cannot drag the boat up against the stream? He who, besides his rights of animal life, to eat and to sleep, acknowledges any human duty, knows very well wherein such duty consists, just in the same way as a boatman knows that he has only to get into his breast-collar and to walk in the given direction. He will only seek to know what to do and how to do it after having fulfilled his duty. As with the boatman, and with all men who do any labor in common, so with the labor of all mankind. Each man need only keep on his breast-collar and go in the given direction, and for this purpose one and the same reason is given to all men, that this direction may always be the same. That this direction is given to us is obvious and certain from the lives of those who surround us, as well as in the conscience of every man, and in all the previous expressions of human wisdom, so that only he who does not want work can say that he does not see it. What, then, will come out of this? This, that first one man, then another, will drag. Looking at them, a third will join. And so one by one the best men will join, until the business will be set a-going, and will move as of itself, inducing those also to join, who do not yet understand why and wherefore it is being done. First, to the number of men who conscientiously work in order to fulfill the law of God, will be added those who will accept half conscientiously and half upon faith. Then to these a still greater number of men, only upon faith in the foremost men. And lastly the majority of people. And then it will come to pass that men will cease to ruin themselves, and will find out happiness. This will happen, and it will happen soon, when men of our circle, and after them all the great majority of working people, will no longer consider it shameful to clean sewers, but will consider it shameful to fill them up in order that other men, our brethren, may carry their contents away. They will not consider it shameful to go visiting in common boots, but they will consider it shameful to walk in galoshes beside barefooted people. They will not think it shameful not to know French, nor about the last novel, but they will consider it shameful to eat bread, and not to know how it is prepared. They will not consider it shameful not to have a starched shirt, or a clean dress, but that it is shameful to wear a clean coat as a token of one's idleness. They will not consider it shameful to have dirty hands, but shameful not to have calluses on their hands. All this will come to pass when public opinion demands it. Public opinion will demand it when men get rid of those snares which hide the truth from them. Great changes in this direction have taken place within my memory. These changes occurred only as public opinion changed. Within my memory has happened this, that, whereas rich men were ashamed if they could not drive out with a team of 4 horses, with 2 men-servants, and that it was considered shameful not to have a manservant or a maid, to dress one, wash one, attend the chamber, and so on, now of a sudden it has become shameful not to dress and wash oneself, without help, or to drive out with men-servants. all these changes have been accomplished by public opinion. Can we not see the changes which public opinion is now preparing? 25 years ago it sufficed to destroy the snare which justified serfdom, and public opinion changed its attitude as to what is praiseworthy and what is shameful, and life changed. It would suffice to destroy the snares justifying the power of money over men, and public opinion will change its view concerning things praiseworthy and things shameful, and life will change. But the destroying of the snare justifying the power of money, and the change of public opinion in this direction, is already quickly taking place. This snare is already transparent and but slightly veils the truth. One needs only to look more attentively to see clearly that change of public opinion which not only must take place, but which has been already accomplished, only not yet consciously acknowledged, not yet named. Let a slightly educated man of our time think of the consequences ensuing from those views he holds concerning the universe, and he will see that the unconscious estimate of good and evil, of praiseworthy and shameful, by which he is guided in life, directly contradicts all his conceptions of life. Let a man of our times dismiss himself, if only for a minute, from his own inert life, and looking at it as an outsider, subject it to that very estimate resulting from his conception of life, and he will stand aghast before the definition of his life, which results from his conception of the world. Let us take as an example a young man. In young people the life energy is stronger, and the self-consciousness is more vague, of the wealthy classes, and of any shade of opinions. Every decent youth considers it a shame not to help an old man, a child, a woman. He considers it a shame to risk the life and health of another in common work while avoiding the danger for himself. Everybody considers it shameful and barbarous to do what Schuyler tells about the Kirghiz, who during storms sent out their wives and old women to hold the corners of the tent, while they remained inside drinking their kumis. Everybody considers it a shame to force a weak man to work for him, and still more shameful when in such danger as, say, a ship on fire, for the strongest to push aside the weak and to go first into the lifeboat, and so on. Men consider all this shameful, and would by no means act so under certain exceptional circumstances. But in everyday life the same actions, and even worse, being hidden by snares, are constantly committed by them. One need only think of it earnestly to recognize the horror of it. A young man changes his shirts daily. Who washes them? A woman, whatever her state may be, very often old enough to be his mother or grandmother, often unwell. How would this young man call another who, out of whim, changes his clean shirt and sends it to be washed by a woman old enough to be his mother? A young man, that he may be smart, provides himself with horses, and an old man, fit to be his father or grandfather, is set to training them, thus endangering his very life, and the young man rides on the horse when danger is over. What would the young man say about a man who, avoiding a dangerous situation for himself, puts another into it, and for his pleasure allows such a risk? Yet the whole life of the well-to-do classes consists of a chain of such actions. The overtaxing labor of old men, children, and women, and work connected with danger to life done by others, not to help us to work but to satisfy our whims, these fill up our life. The fisherman gets drowned while catching fish for us. The washerwomen catch colds and die. The smith grows blind. Those who work in factories get ill and injured by machinery. Woodcutters are crushed by falling trees. Workmen fall from roofs and are killed. Needlewomen pine away. All real work is done with waste and danger to life. To hide this and refuse to see it is impossible. There is one salvation, one issue out of this situation, to wit, that if a man of our time is not to be obliged, according to his own principles, to call himself a scoundrel and a coward, who burdens others with work and danger to life, he must take from men only what is necessary for his life, and submit himself also to true labor associated with waste and danger to life. Within my memory, more striking changes have taken place. I remember that at table, a servant stood with a plate behind each chair. Men made visits accompanied by 2 footmen. A Cossack boy and a girl stood in a room to give people their pipes, and to clean them, and so on. Now this seems to us strange and remarkable. But is it not equally strange that a young man or woman, or even an elderly man, that he may visit a friend, should order his horses to be harnessed, and that well-fed horses are kept only for this purpose? Is it not as strange that one man lives in 5 rooms, or that a woman spends tens, hundreds, thousands of rubles for her dress, when she only needs some flax and wool wherewith to spin dresses for herself, and clothes for her husband and children? Is it not strange that men live doing nothing, riding to and fro, smoking and playing, and that a battalion of people are busy feeding and warming them? Is it not strange that old people quite gravely talk and write in newspapers about theatres and music, and other insane people drive to look at musicians or actors? Is it not strange that tens of thousands of boys and girls are brought up so as to make them unfit for every work? They return home from school, and their 2 books are carried for them by a servant. There will soon come a time, and it is already drawing near, when it will be shameful to dine on 5 courses served by footmen, and cooked by any but the masters themselves. It will be shameful not only to ride thoroughbreds or to drive in a coach when one has feet to walk on, to wear on weekdays dress, shoes, gloves, in which it is impossible to work. It will be shameful to play on a piano which costs £150, or even £10, while others work for one, to feed dogs upon milk and white bread, when there are men who have neither milk nor bread, and to burn lamps and candles without working by their light, to heat stoves in which no meal is cooked, while there are men who have neither light nor fuel. Then it will be impossible to think about giving openly not merely £1, but even 6 for a place in a concert or in a theatre. All this will be when the law of labor becomes public opinion. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of What Shall We Do? By Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. As it is said in the Bible, there is a law given unto man and woman. To man, the law of labor. To woman, the law of childbearing. Although with our science, nous avons changé tout ça, the law of man, as well as of woman, remains as immutable as the liver in its place, and the breach of it is inevitably punished by death. The only difference is that, for man, the breach of law is punished by death in such a near future that it can almost be called present, but for woman, the breach of law is punished in a more distant future. A general breach, by all men, of the law, destroys men immediately. The breach by women destroys the men of the following generation. The evasion of the law by a few men and women does not destroy the human race, but deprives the offender of rational human nature. The breach of this law by men began years ago, in the classes which could use violence with others, and, spreading on its way, it has reached our day, and has now attained madness, the ideal contained in a breach of the law, the ideal expressed by Prince Blokin, and shared by Renan and the whole educated world. Work will be done by machines, and men will be bundles of nerves enjoying themselves. There has been scarcely any breach of the law by women. It has only manifested itself in prostitution, and in private cases of crime-destroying progeny. Women of the wealthy classes have fulfilled their law, while men did not fulfill theirs, and therefore women have grown stronger, and have continued to govern, and will govern, men who have deviated from their law, and who, consequently, have lost their reason. It is generally said that women, the women of Paris, especially those who are childless, have become so bewitching, using all the means of civilization, that they have mastered man by their charms. This is not only wrong, but it is just the reverse of the truth. It is not the childless woman who has mastered man, it is the mother, the one who has fulfilled her duty, while man has not fulfilled his. As to the woman who artificially remains childless, and bewitches man by her shoulders and curls, she is not a woman mastering man, but a woman corrupted by him, reduced to the level of the corrupted man, who, as well as he, has deviated from her duty, who, as well as he, has lost every reasonable sense of life. This mistake also produces the astounding nonsense which is called woman's rights. The formula of these rights is as follows. "You men," says woman, "have deviated from your law of true labor, and want us to carry the load of ours. No, if so, we also, as well as you, will make a pretense of labor, as you do in banks, ministries, universities, and academies. We wish, as well as you, by the pretense of division of work, to profit by other people's work, and to live only to satisfy our lust." They say so, and indeed show that they can make that pretense of labor not at all worse, but even better than men do it. The so-called question of women's rights arose, and could only arise, among men who had deviated from the law of real labor. One has only to return to it, and that question must cease to exist. A woman who has her own particular, inevitable labor will never claim the right of sharing man's labor, in mines or in plowing fields. She claims her share only in the sham labor of the wealthy classes. The woman of our class was stronger than man, and is now still stronger, not through her charms, not through her skill in performing the same Pharisaic similitude of work as man, but because she has not stepped outside of the law, because she has borne that true labor, with danger of life, with uttermost effort, true labor, from which the man of the wealthy classes has freed himself. But within my memory has begun also the deviation from the law by woman, that is to say, her fall, and within my memory it has proceeded farther and farther. A woman who has lost the law believes that her power consists in the charms of her witchery, or in her skill at a Pharisaic pretense of intellectual labor. Children hinder the one and the other. Therefore, with the help of science is always helpful to everything wicked, within my memory it has come to pass that among the wealthy classes scores of means of destroying progeny have appeared, and these means become a common attribute of the toilette. And behold, women, mothers, some of them of the wealthy classes, who held their power in their hands, let it slip away, and place themselves on a level with women of the street. The evil has spread far, and spreads farther every day, and will soon grasp all the women of the wealthy classes, and then they will be on a level with the men, and together with them will lose every reasonable sense of life. There will be no return for this class then. But there is yet time, for there still remain more women than men who accomplish the law of their life. Therefore there are still reasonable beings among them, and thus some of the women of our class hold in their hands the possibility of salvation. If only women would understand their worth, their power, and would use these for the work of salvation of their husbands, brothers, and children, the salvation of all men. Women, mothers of the wealthy classes, in your hands is the salvation of men of our world from the evils from which it suffers. Not those women who are occupied by their figures, bustles, head-dresses, and their charms for men, and who, against their will, by accident and in despair bear children, and then give them over to wet nurses. Nor yet those who go to different lectures, and talk of psychometrical centers of differentiation, and who also try to free themselves from bearing children not to hinder their folly, which they call development. But those women and mothers who, having the power of freeing themselves from childbearing, hold strictly and consciously to that eternal, immutable law, knowing that the weight and labor of that submission is the aim of their life. These women and mothers of our wealthy classes are those in whose hands, more than in any others, lies the salvation of the men of our sphere in life, from the calamities which oppress them. You women and mothers who submit consciously to the law of God, you are the only ones who, in our miserable, mutilated circle which has lost all semblance of humanity, know the whole true meaning of life according to the law of God. And you are the only ones who, by your example, can show men the happiness of that submission to God's law of which they rob themselves. You are the only ones who know the joy and happiness which takes possession of one's whole being, the bliss which is the share of every man who does not deviate from God's law. You know the joy of love to your husband, a joy never ending, never destroyed like all other joys, but forming the beginning of another new joy, love to your child. You are the only ones, when you are simple and submissive to God's law, who know, not the farcical pretense of labor which men of your world call labor, but that true labor which is imposed by God upon men. And you know the rewards for it, the bliss which it gives. You know it when after the joys of love, you expect with emotion, fear, and hope the torturing state of pregnancy, which makes you ill for 9 months, and brings you to the brink of death and to unbearable sufferings and pains. You know the conditions of true labor, when with joy you expect the approach and increase of the most dreadful sufferings, after which comes the bliss known to you only. You know it when, directly after those sufferings, without rest, without interruption, you undertake another series of labors and sufferings, those of nursing, for the sake of which you subjugate to your feeling and renounce the strongest human necessity, that of sleep, which, according to the saying, is sweeter than father and mother. For months and years you do not sleep 2 nights running, and often you do not sleep whole nights, walking alone to and fro, rocking in your wearied arms an ailing baby, whose sufferings tear your heart. When you do all this, unapproved and unseen by anybody, not expecting any praise or reward for it, when you do this, not as a great deed, but as the laborer of the gospel parable, who came in from the field, considering that you are only doing your duty, you know then what is false, fictitious labor, for human fame, and what is true labor, the fulfillment of God's will, the indication of which you feel in your heart. You know, if you are a true mother, that not only has nobody seen and praised your labor, considering that it is only what ought to be, but even those for whom you toiled are not only ungrateful to you, but often torment and reproach you. With the next child you do the same. Again you suffer. Again you bear unseen, terrible toil, and again you do not expect any reward from anybody, and feel the same satisfaction. If you are such, in your hands must lie the power over men, and in your hands lies the salvation. Your number is decreasing every day. Some, busy with practicing their charms over men, become prostitutes. Others are engaged in competition with men in their artificial, ludicrous occupations. The third, who have not yet renounced their vocation, begin to repudiate it in their minds. They perform all the deeds of women and mothers, but accidentally, with grumblings and envy of the free women not bearing children, and so deprive themselves of the only reward for them, the inner consciousness of the fulfillment of God's will, and instead of being satisfied, they suffer from what is really their happiness. We are so confused by our false life. We, men of our circle, have all of us so utterly lost the sense of life, that we do not differ one from another. Having loaded others with all the burdens and dangers of life, we dare not call ourselves by the true names deserved by those who force others to perish in providing life for them. Scoundrels, cowards. But among women a distinction still exists. There are women, human beings, women, presenting the highest manifestation of a human being, and there are women, prostitutes. This discrimination will be made by succeeding generations, and we, too, cannot help making it. Every woman, however she dresses, however she calls herself, however refined she may be, if being married she abstains from bearing children, is a prostitute. However low a lost woman may be, if she consciously devotes herself to bearing children, she does the best and highest work of life in fulfilling the will of God, and she has no superior. If you are such, you will not say, after 2 or after 20 children, that you have borne children enough, as a 50-year-old workman will not say that he has worked enough, while he still eats and sleeps and his muscles demand work. If you are such, you will not cast the trouble of nursing and care on a strange mother, any more than a workman will give the work which he has begun and nearly finished to another man, because in that work you put your life, and because, the more you have of that work, the fuller and happier is your life. But when you are like this, and happily for men there are yet such women, the same law of fulfillment of God's will, by which you guide your own life, you will also apply to the life of your husband, of your children, and of men near to you. If you are such, and if you know by experience that only self-denied, unseen, unrewarded labor, with danger of life, and uttermost effort for the life of others is the mission of man which gives satisfaction, you will claim the same from others. You will encourage your husband to do the same labor. You will value and appreciate the worth of men by this same labor, and for it you will prepare your children. Only that mother who looks on childbearing as a disagreeable accident, and upon the pleasures of love, comfort, education, sociability, as the meaning of life, will bring up her children so that they shall have as many pleasures, and enjoy them as much as possible, will feed them luxuriously, dress them smartly, will artificially divert them, and will teach them, not that which will make them capable of self-sacrificing man's and woman's labor with danger of life and uttermost effort, but that which will deliver them from that labor, which will give them diplomas and idleness. Only such a woman, who has lost the significance of her life, will sympathize with that false, sham man's labor, by means of which her husband, freeing himself from man's duty, may profit, together with her, by the labor of others. Only such a woman will choose a similar husband for her daughter, and will value men, not for what they are in themselves, but for what is attached to them: position, money, the art of profiting by the labor of others. A true mother, who really knows God's law, will prepare her children for the fulfillment of it. For such a mother it will be suffering to see her child overfed, pampered, overdressed, because all this, she knows, will hinder it in the fulfillment of God's law, experienced by herself. Such a woman will not teach that which will give her son or daughter the possibility of delivering themselves from labor, but that which will help them to bear the labor of life. She will not want to ask what to teach her children, or for what to prepare them, knowing what it is, and in what consists the mission of men, and consequently knowing what to teach her children, and for what to prepare them. Such a woman will not only discourage her husband from false, sham labor, the only aim of which is to profit by other people's work, but will view with disgust and dread an activity that will serve as a double temptation for her children. Such a woman will not choose her daughter's husband according to the whiteness of his hands and the refinement of his manners, but, knowing thoroughly what is labor and what deceit, will always and everywhere, beginning with her husband, respect and appreciate men in claiming from them true labor with waste and danger of life, and will scorn that false, sham labor which has for its aim the delivering of one's self from true labor. And let not those women say who, while renouncing the vocation of women, desire to profit by its rights, "Let such a view of life is impossible for a mother, that a mother is too intimately connected by love to her children to deprive them of sweets, smart dresses, or entertainments, or not to fear their being unprovided for, if the husband has no fortune or secure position, or not to be afraid for the future of the marrying daughters and sons who have not got an education." All this is a lie, a burning lie. A true mother will never say this. You cannot keep yourself from the desire to give them sweets, toys, to take them to the circus. But surely you don't give them poisonous berries to eat. You do not let them go out alone in a boat. You do not take them to a café chantant. Why, then, can you restrain yourselves in this case and not in that? Because you do not tell the truth. You say that you love the children so much that you fear for their life. You are so afraid of hunger and cold, and that is why you appreciate so much the security which your husband's position provides for you, though you consider it unlawful. You are so afraid of future eventualities, calamities for your children which are very distant and doubtful, and you therefore encourage your husband to do things unjustifiable in your opinion. But what are you doing now to secure your children in their present conditions of life from the unfortunate eventualities of the present life? Do you spend much of your time during the day with your children? You do well if you spend 1/10 of the day. The remaining time they are under the care of strangers, hired people, often taken from the street, or they are in institutions, open to the dangers of moral and physical infection. Your children eat, they are nourished. Who cooks their dinner and what from? Mostly you know nothing about it. Who instills moral principles into them? Neither do you know that. Then do not say that you are suffering evil for the good of your children. It is not true. You do evil because you like it. A true mother, the one who in bearing and bringing up children sees her self-sacrificing vocation of life and the fulfillment of God's will not say it. She will not say it because she knows it is not her business to make of her children what she herself or current opinions require. She knows that children, i.e., the following generations, are the greatest and most sacred thing which is given to men to behold in reality, and to serve with all her being this sacred cause is her life. She knows herself, being constantly between life and death, and ever rearing the feebly flickering life, that life and death are not her business. Her business is to serve life, and she will not therefore search for distant paths of this service, but will only endeavor not to avoid the near one. Such a mother will bring forth and nurse her children herself, and above all things else will feed and provide for them, will work for them, wash and teach them, will sleep and talk with them, because she makes that her life work. Only such a mother will not seek for her children external security through her husband's money or her children's diplomas, but she will exercise in them the same capacity of self-sacrificing fulfillment of God's will which she knows in herself, the capacity for bearing labor with waste and danger of life, because she knows that only in that lie the security and welfare of life. Such a mother will not have to ask others what is her duty. She will know everything, and will fear nothing, for she will always know that she has done what she was called to do. If there can be doubts for a man, or for a childless woman, about the way to fulfill God's will, for a mother that way is firmly and clearly drawn. And if she fulfills it humbly, with a simple heart, standing on the highest point of good, which it is only given to a human being to attain, she becomes the guiding star for all men, tending to the same good. Only a mother can before her death say to him who sent her into this world, and to him whom she has served by bearing and bringing up children, beloved by her more than herself, only she can peacefully say, after having served him in her appointed service, "Now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace." And this is that highest perfection to which, as the highest good, men aspire. Such women who fulfill their mission are those who reign over reigning men, and serve as a guiding star to humanity, those who prepare new generations of men and form public opinion, and therefore in the hands of these women lies the highest power of men's salvation from the existing and threatening evils of our time. Yes, women, mothers, in your hands, more than in those of any others, lies the salvation of the world. Note to Chapter 40. The vocation of every man and woman is to serve other people. With this general proposition, I think all who are not immoral people will agree. The difference between men and women in the fulfillment of that vocation is only in the means by which they attain it, that is to say, by which they serve men. Man serves others by physical work, procuring food, by intellectual work, studying the laws of nature in order to master it, and by social work, instituting forms of life, and establishing mutual relationships between people. The means of serving others are various for men. The whole activity of mankind, with the exception of bearing children and rearing them, is open for his service to men. A woman, in addition to the possibility of serving men by all the means open to man, is, by the construction of her body, called, and inevitably attracted, to serve others by that which alone is excepted from the domain of the service of man. The service of mankind is divided into two parts. One, the augmentation of the welfare of mankind. The other, the continuation of the race. Men are called chiefly to the first, as they are deprived of the possibility of fulfilling the second. Women are called exclusively to the second, as they only are fitted for it. This difference one should not, one cannot, forget or destroy, and it would be sinful to do so. From this difference proceed the duties of each, duties not invented by men, but which are in the nature of things. From the same difference proceeds the estimation of virtue and vice for woman and man, the estimation which has existed in every century, which exists now, and which will never cease to exist while reason exists in men. It always has been the case, and it always will be, that a man who spends a great part of his life in the various physical and mental labors which are natural to him, and a woman who spends a great part of her life in the labor of bearing, nursing, and rearing children, which is her exclusive prerogative, will alike feel that they are doing their duty, and will alike rise in the esteem and love of other people, because they both fulfill what is appointed, because such is the substance of the matter. The vocation of man is broader and more varied, the vocation of woman more uniform and narrower, but more profound. And therefore it has always been, and always will be, the case that man, having hundreds of duties, will be neither a bad nor a pernicious man, even when he has been false to 1 or 10 out of them, if he fulfills the greater part of his vocation. While woman, as she has a smaller number of duties, if she is false to 1 of them, instantly falls lower than a man who has been false to 10 out of his hundreds of duties. Such has always been the general opinion, and such it will always remain, because such is the substance of the matter. A man, in order to fulfill God's will, must serve him in the domain of physical work, thought, and morality. In all these ways he can fulfill his vocation. Woman's service to God consists chiefly and almost exclusively in bearing children, because no one except herself can render it. Only by means of work is man called to serve God and his fellow men. Only by means of her children is a woman called to serve them. Therefore, that love to her own children which is inborn in woman, that exclusive love against which it is quite vain to strive by reasoning, will always be, and ought to be, natural to a woman and a mother. That love to a child in its infancy is not egotism, it is the love of a workman for the work which he is doing while it is in his hands. Take away that love for the object of one's work, and the work becomes impossible. While I am making a boot, I love it above everything. If I did not love it, I could not work at it. If anybody spoils it for me, I am in despair. But I only love it thus while I am working at it. When it is completed, there remains an attachment, a preference, which is weak and illegitimate. It is the same with a mother. A man is called to serve others by multifarious labors, and he loves those labors while he is accomplishing them. A woman is called to serve others by her children, and she cannot help loving those children of hers while she is rearing them to the age of 3, 7, or 10 years. In the general vocation of serving God and others, man and woman are entirely equal, notwithstanding the difference of the form of that service. The equality consists in the equal importance of one service and of the other, that the one is impossible without the other, that the one depends upon the other, and that for efficient service, as well for man as for woman, the knowledge of truth is equally necessary. Without this knowledge, the activity of man and woman becomes not useful but pernicious for mankind. Man is called to fulfill his multifarious labor, but his labor is only useful, and his physical, mental, and social labor is only fruitful, when it is fulfilled in the name of truth and the welfare of others. A man can occupy himself as zealously as he will to increase his pleasures by vain reasoning, and with social activity for his own advantage. His labor will not be fruitful. It will be so only when it is directed towards lessening the suffering of others through want and ignorance, and from false social organization. The same with woman's vocation. Her bearing, nursing, and bringing up children will only be useful to mankind when she gives birth to children, not only for her own pleasure, but when she prepares future servants of mankind, when the education of those children is done in the name of truth and for the welfare of others. That is to say, when she will educate her children in such a manner that they shall be the very best men possible, and the very best laborers for others. The ideal woman, in my opinion, is the one who, appropriating the highest view of life of the time in which she lives, yet gives herself to her feminine mission, which is irresistibly placed in her, that of bringing forth, nursing, and educating the greatest possible number of children, fitted to work for people according to the view which she has of life. In order to appropriate the highest view of life, I think there is no need of visiting lectures. All that she requires is to read the Gospel, and not to shut her eyes, ears, and, most of all, her heart. Well, and if you ask what those are to do who have no children, who are not married, or who are widows, I answer that those will do well to share man's multifarious labor. But one cannot help feeling sorry that such a precious tool as woman is, should be bereft of the possibility of fulfilling the great vocation which it is given to her alone to fulfill. Especially as every woman, when she has finished bearing children, if she has strength left, will have time to occupy herself with help in man's labor. Woman's help in that labor is very precious, but it will always be a pity to see a young woman fit for childbearing occupied by man's labor. To see such a woman is the same as to see precious vegetable soil covered with stones as a place of parade or as a walking ground. Still more a pity, because the earth could only produce bread, and a woman could produce that for which there cannot be any equivalent, than which there is nothing higher, man, and only she is able to do this. End of chapter 40. Recording by Joanna Michal Hoyt. End of What Shall We Do by Leo Tolstoy.